Chapter 2657. The entire sky was filled with this crystal. The crystal grew to the size of a fist. Even the fist-sized crystal was still surrounded by a huge whirlpool, and the gold-type spiritual energy of heaven and earth was constantly gathering in the whirlpool. The crystal was still growing, and large silver-white crystals gradually condensed, floating in the sky above the sword tomb. The crystals were multi-edged and looked extremely beautiful. At this time, Yu Tong's expression was even more shocked. However, this large silver-white crystal did not stop condensing and spreading, and it was still extremely stable as it extended into the distance. Which master is this? It's actually... Before he could say actually, he heard a kacha sound of thunder. In the sky more than 100 li above the sword tomb, heavenly lightning flashed that had never appeared before. This is lightning tribulation? Seeing the golden heavenly lightning in the sky, which was completely different from what he usually saw, Yu Tong's expression changed. It seems to be. It's a demonic beast. Third gold tribulation? Damn it, this Feng Ying is actually a demonic beast in human form. He even cultivated to the nascent soul stage. Yu Tong's eyes flashed with understanding and his body trembled. How could he dare to stay for even half a moment longer? His body swayed and he fled towards where he went. However, the gold-type spiritual energy of heaven and earth around him was completely condensed, and for a moment, there really was not enough spiritual energy for him to use the gold escape technique. Yu Tong could only use the flying technique in a panic, and flew out a full 200 li before that sparkling and translucent silver-white crystal gradually disappeared. This kind of advancement power, other than the nascent soul stage. What else could it be? However, he still had some doubts in his heart. First of all, this was extremely likely to be a demonic beast in human form. The nascent soul stage's power was shocking, but it seemed to be different from an ordinary cultivator's nascent soul stage. Especially that pressure. Why was it the same as a golden core stage? In fact, the nascent soul stage did not even appear. Of course, these doubts flashed past. After all, Feng Ying was a demonic beast in human form, and it was probably different from an ordinary cultivator's nascent soul stage. Secondly, within 100 li, it was Xiaohua's divine sense. Why? Xiaohua's method did not chase out? Even if this was the key to conceiving a nascent soul, it was not too difficult to take advantage of the confinement of the heavenly Tao to kill him. Of course, in the end, these doubts turned into joy for Yu Tong. If it weren't for these mistakes, would he have been able to escape with his life? Actually, it wasn't that Xiaohua didn't want to kill Yu Tong. After all, Yu Tong knew his bottom line. He didn't want this person to live on the Dawn Rain continent. However, just as Xiaohua wanted to use the restriction to advance, a tearing pain suddenly appeared in his lower dantian. It was as if his entire dantian was being torn apart. Xiaohua turned pale with fright and hurriedly split his divine sense into a strand of inner vision. When Xiaohua's divine sense sank into his lower dantian, he was so scared that 2 of his 3 souls left his body. He didn't know what to do. How could he still care about killing Yu Tong? Northeast of where Xiaohua and Ning Dan were, LV Ruochang couldn't restrain her ecstasy. She looked at the other illusory swordsmen who were also surprised. She didn't hide her joy and said loudly, "Fellow swordsmen, the heavens didn't disappoint our brave warriors. Now, it's finally our turn to reap the fruits of victory. Let's go." After saying that, LV Ruochang took the lead and flew into the distance. Junior sister LV. Ruoling was naturally happy as well. She glanced at the people beside her and shouted as she flew, "Although the Dao Sect's cultivators have already caught up and are about to fall into junior sister's hands, we've lost too many disciples. However, we have lost too many disciples. There are only 70,000 disciples here. Moreover, we are all injured. We may not be able to fight against the cultivators. In your earlier arrangements, I wonder if we've also made arrangements?" "Don't worry, senior sister Ruoling," LV Ruochang said proudly. "Although I've placed you and me in the formation earlier, I've also placed the Skyscraper Sword Sect, the High Wind Sword Sect, and even Valley Master Chi Peng of the Swarm of Makuz Valley. However, the battle situation has changed and I've already made some arrangements. Although the power of the sword formation won't be as great as imagined, I guarantee that even without you and me, none of the hundreds of thousands of Dao Sect's cultivators will be able to escape from the Great Square Sword formation." Zhu Qingye also flew over and said with a smile, "I don't wish to kill all of these cultivators. I only wish to kill most of them and avenge sword friend Song Yuan." Also, sword friend Elvik Mu Ting also suggested, "I don't know how powerful the Great Square Sword formation is, but I feel that, it's better to leave a barely discernible way out. Otherwise, if the Dao sect's cultivators go all out and fight with their lives on the line, I'm afraid that we'll suffer even more losses. LV Ruochang flew on her sword in the air. Her thin lips curled slightly as she sneered, "Sword friend Mu is right, but how many of my sword domain's warriors have been killed by the cultivators? I wish I could stab them to death one by one. Moreover, I've put in so much effort to set up the great square sword formation in order to capture all of them in one fell swoop. I'm afraid that it'll be difficult to show mercy now." "Sword friend Mu didn't want you to show mercy," Ruoling said with a smile. "She merely saw the Dao sect's cultivators' weakness in setting up the formation and warned you not to kill them all. She wanted to prevent the Dao sect's cultivators from doing anything desperate." I understand." LV Ruochang was very respectful towards Ruoling and said with a smile, "How could there be any weakness in the great square sword formation? There's no way out. If the cultivators have any tricks up their sleeves, they can use them all. I'll take them all on." Seeing that LV Ruochang was so confident, no one was willing to say anything else. Their thoughts were the same as LV Ruochang's. They wished for the cultivators to all die. If they could kill 10,000, they definitely wouldn't stop at 9,999. After flying for half a meal, a swordsman wearing a pitch-black sword robe suddenly appeared in the air. The pouring rain seemed to directly rush into the swordsman's body, but also seemed to fall from the swordsman's sword formation. In short, it made people feel that this person was just an illusion. "Sword friend Yi?" LV Ruochang seemed to be unable to recognize this swordsman and asked tentatively. "Sword friend LV." The swordsman's sword robe was very strange. It hid his head and face, and even the people's divine senses couldn't penetrate it. That person heard LV Ruochang's question and replied, "I've been waiting here for a long time." "Thank you, sword friend Yi." LV Ruochang was very respectful towards this swordsman. He cupped his hands and said, "After this battle, I'll definitely fulfill my promise to sword friend Yi." I hope so." Swordsman Yi wasn't respectful because of LV Ruochang's respect. He just waved his hand and said casually. LV Ruochang didn't mind and asked again, "Sword friend Yi's matter? How are the arrangements?" "That's why I came to see you." That swordsman didn't answer directly. "I don't know if the matter you promised me. Can I take action now?" "Good." LV Ruochang nodded. "According to our previous agreement, sword friend Yi can take action when you see my signal. It's a deal." As swordsman Yi spoke, his figure actually dissipated. It was as if he was washed away by the rain and disappeared. "Sword friend LV. This person." Ruoling was very surprised as she watched swordsman Yi disappear and asked softly. However, LV Ruochang didn't answer. Instead, he smiled slightly. That smile was filled with mystery. Everyone flew forward again. After half a meal's time, a figure flew over from afar and landed in front of everyone. It was an old man with a sharp mouth. Everyone was familiar with this old man. It was Qing Feng of the Quilted Mountain sect. "Greetings, sword friend LV." Qing Feng cupped his hands and said as he looked around. "Greetings, sword friend Qing Feng." LV Ruochang faced Qing Feng and clearly wasn't as respectful as he was towards swordsman Yi. He said indifferently, "Have you arranged the array that I instructed you to do? I'll let sword friend LV and the other sword friends know." Qing Feng had a bitter expression on his face. It was unknown if it was his original expression or if it was something he couldn't say. He said, "This sword has followed sword friend LV's arrangements completely. Everything is in place." "Good. After this battle, your Quilted Mountain sect will have done a great service." LV Ruochang nodded. "Senior brother Tsang Yuan?" Qing Feng clearly didn't discover Tsang Yuan's whereabouts and could only ask. "Alas, sword friend Tsang Yuan died in the Dao sect's array." LV Ruochang sighed and said, "You set up the spirit-devouring array and kill as many cultivators as you can to avenge sword friend Tsang Yuan." "Yes, this old man understands." Qing Feng nodded sadly. He cupped his hands and flew up again. That hunchback of his became even hunchier. Spirit-devouring array? Mu Ting's eyes turned rapidly. She had heard that the spirit-devouring array needed to be set up and that the spirit-devouring bugs used in this array had to go through many twists and turns because of the terrifying phoenix. However, she didn't expect that this array had already been set up by Qing Feng of the Quilted Mountain sect. Just as she was about to ask, LV Ruochang and Ruoling flew up again. Mu Ting turned her head and looked behind her. The brilliance of the Dao sect cultivator's Dharma treasures soared into the sky and almost dyed the night sky behind her. She didn't dare to stay any longer and hurriedly chased after them. Then 2 more swordsmen came to greet them. One was by Tianming of the Three-Sword Sect and the other was Xiujia of the Kuan Sword Sect. They were both second-grade illusory swords. When they saw LV Ruochang, the first thing he said was, "Have you finished setting up the sword array?" The two of them said the same thing, "We've been waiting for a long time." When Ruoling and the others saw Qing Feng of the Quilted Mountain Sect, they were familiar with him. However, when they saw the Three-Sword Sect and the Kuan Sword Sect that didn't reveal themselves in the sword battle, they suddenly realized that these second-rate sword sects had been sent here by LV Ruochang to set up the array. It was no wonder that LV Ruochang was so depressed when she was trapped in the 10-direction annihilation array. LV Ruochang still had many other arrangements in the sword tomb. Chapter 2658. However, Zhu Qingye immediately had a trace of doubt. He was not the first batch of disciples sent out by the Bright Sword Sect. He was appointed after Zhong Haoshuan of the Bright Sword Sect was killed by Xiao Hua. After he came to the battlefield, although he had heard about the giants and dwarves participating in the battle, he did not see much of it. Even his friend Ji Minka of the Matian Sword Sect was nowhere to be seen. However, if Ji Minka was also setting up a formation in the sword tomb, why would these grade 2 illusory swordsmen come out to greet them? Why would Ji Minka, a grade 3 illusory swordsman, avoid meeting them? At this time LV Ruochang also sent away Xiujia of the Kunjian sect and said, "Fellow swordsmen, 5 miles from here, there is a hill full of blooming purple jasmine flowers. Let's restrain our disciples and gather there." After saying that, he did not say another word. His figure turned into a sword and headed to the side. Although Zhu Qingye and the others were somewhat confused, they knew that this was a crucial moment. They all rushed to the sky and ordered their disciples to contact the disciples of their respective sword sects to gather in front of them. Just as LV Ruochang said, in the night rain, a hill with a radius of 1,000 feet was just 5 miles away. This was really a hill. It was less than 3 feet above the ground, and it was covered with purple jasmine flowers. In the pitch-black night, the rain was getting heavier. The large purple jasmine flowers had their buds lowered. Many of the purple jasmine flowers had withered. Pieces of purple color stuck to the ground, or flowed down the hill with the flow of water, rushing to the flat ground. When everyone arrived, LV Ruochang was already standing on the top of the hill. He raised his eyes and looked at the place where the cultivators came from. His eyes were burning with passion. The disciples of the Black Phoenix Sword Sect had already lined up neatly and gathered on one side of the hill. Although these disciples had a trace of a smile on their faces, looking at the broken sword equipment and the few thousand disciples, no one would be happy. Ruoling and the others flew to the top of the hill. The disciples of their respective sects also scattered around the hill in an orderly manner. "Disciples, do you know where this place is?" LV Ruochang looked at Ruoling and the others, then raised his head and shouted to the 70,000 disciples below the hill. The entire area below the hill was completely silent. Only the sound of raindrops could be heard. Even Ruoling and the others were at a loss in their hearts. Not to mention that it was a rainy night. Even if it was a sunny day, who would know what kind of ruins this huge sword tomb spanned for thousands of miles? Of course, everyone knew that there must be a story behind this hill, and it must be where the sword cultivator had suffered a crushing defeat. But, sword cultivators had suffered crushing defeats so many times, who would know which one it was? However, LV Ruochang didn't speak immediately when no one spoke. Instead, her bright and spirited eyes scanned the swordsmen one by one. That aggressive gaze made every swordsman lower their heads in shame. After half a cup of tea's time, the sound of Dao sect cultivators flying through the air could be heard in the distance. LV Ruochang then said angrily, "It's not that I want to blame everyone here today, but the ancestors of my sword domain have shed their blood in the sword domain. Who knows how many people have been buried? Their hope of defeating the Dao sect had yet to be fulfilled. We may not be talented, we may not have the hot-bloodedness of these ancestors, we may not have the cultivation of these seniors. But, we cannot lack the spirit of the sword domain seniors to pass down the torch. We cannot lack the determination to carve this humiliation into our hearts and our lofty bones. Our seniors of the sword domain have suffered defeat after defeat. They have used their unyielding spirit as a seed to plant in their hearts, in the hearts of all the warriors of the sword domain. We have all grown up listening to the deeds of our seniors of the sword domain. Every one of us has the shadow of a senior in our hearts." LV Ruochang spoke passionately. "We all want to be like the heroes in our hearts whose names resound throughout the sword domain. However, this is not the most important thing. The most important thing is that we cannot forget the humiliation that the Dao sect has inflicted on us for the past 10,000 years, or even 100,000 years. This humiliation can only be washed away with the blood and lives of the Dao sect cultivators. Look beneath your feet, this is an ordinary high slope. LV Ruochang pointed with his finger, his face filled with respect. That year, a famous sword sect in the sword domain, under the leadership of 2 sword transformation seniors, fought a decisive battle with the 3 Dao sect sects in the sword tomb. That sect fought until not a single disciple was left, and they dragged the other 3 sects to their deaths in the sword tomb. The 2 sword transformation seniors of that sword sect gave up on the chance to escape and were killed by 3 nascent soul cultivators from the 3 sects. Why did they do this? It was so that the sword domain's 16 sword sects would not be discovered by the Dao sect cultivators, so that the plan of the sword domain seniors could be carried out safely. However, during that great battle, the sword formation was discovered by the Dao sect cultivators in the end. In the end, they were unable to surround the cultivators, and in the end, they did not obtain victory in the battle. LV Ruochang's tone was somewhat sorrowful. Of course, in the end, this sword sect that was destroyed by the 3 Dao sects did not receive the glory that they deserved. Furthermore, after that great battle, this sword sect disappeared without a trace in the sword domain and never appeared again. Oh, so that's how it is. The group of swordsmen were all enlightened. However, since it was a sword sect that had been destroyed long ago, and it was not an extremely prominent sword sect, how would they know? What this sword wants to talk about is this nameless sword sect. There are so many of them in my sword domain, and there are also many swordsmen who silently died on the battlefield. LV Ruochang continued, no matter when we are, no matter if we are defeated or victorious, we cannot forget these nameless swordsmen and nameless sects. LV Jianyu. Ruo Ling suddenly came to a realization and cried out involuntarily, you're talking about the Flying Dragon Sword Sect? This place is what the Dao sect swordsmen are called, the Dragon Punishing Slope? That's right. I didn't expect senior sister Ruo Ling to know about this. LV Ruochang's eyes revealed a trace of surprise. She did not expect Ruo Ling to know about the Flying Dragon Sword Sect. Sigh, I'm ashamed to say this. Ruo Ling's face was somewhat miserable. This sword only happened to look through my sect's sword scroll when I was about to come to the battle and accidentally came across it. It's already good that senior sister can see it. LV Ruochang comforted, in today's sword domain, who would still remember the Flying Dragon Sword Sect? Yes, that's right. Ruo Ling understood LV Ruochang's meaning and said loudly, disciples of the sword domain, about 8,000 years ago, there was a mysterious sword sect in my sword domain, and it was the Flying Dragon Sword Sect. This sword sect's secret Flying Dragon Sword technique, almost every disciple could comprehend the Flying Dragon Sword intent. It was very popular in the sword domain, and for hundreds of years, there was not a single sword sect in the sword domain that could stand shoulder to shoulder with the Flying Dragon Sword Sect. The crowd of swordsmen was completely in an uproar. Almost all of their eyes flashed with disbelief. They seemed to have never heard of such a powerful sword sect. It's just as LV Jianyu said. During that great battle, the Flying Dragon Sword Sect contributed greatly to my sword domain, and killed countless cultivators including nascent soul cultivators. Ruo Ling continued, at the same time at the end of the great battle, the commander of my sword domain decided to set up a sword formation in the sword tomb, preparing to lure the Dao sect cultivators into the sword formation to surround and annihilate them. However, the news was leaked and the Dao sect cultivators rushed into the sword tomb ahead of time. Seeing that the swordsmen had yet to finish setting up the formation, the disciples of the Flying Dragon Sword Sect volunteered to stop the Dao sect cultivators here, and buy time for the warriors of my sword domain to set up the formation. In the end, even when the last person from the Flying Dragon Sword Sect died, the sword formation was still not set up. We sword cultivators still lost that great battle. LV Ruochang continued, and in order to commemorate that great victory, the Dao sect cultivators named this place Dragon Slaying Slope. That's right, the contribution of the Flying Dragon Sword Sect was great. Ruo Ling sighed again, their elites were all killed in the great battle, and the disciples left in the sword domain were not outstanding. And then, seeing that Ruo Ling did not continue, LV Ruochang sneered, and then the Flying Dragon Sword Sect was swallowed up by some sword sects, and disappeared from the sword domain. Indeed. Ruo Ling said in a low voice, when this sword saw this, my heart was also filled with emotions. This kind of sword sect, we, the various sects of the sword domain, should properly protect them. LV Jianyu Zhuqingye frowned, the conditions of my sword domain are terrible. If there is no competition, no fighting, how can warriors be produced? The matter of the Flying Dragon Sword Sect is definitely not intentional, sword friend mentioning it now. Hee, what Zhu Jinyu said is reasonable. LV Ruochang laughed. The survival of the fittest, this is the axiom of my sword domain. This sword once again said that this time, I do not have any intention of blaming any swordsman or any sword sect. This sword only wants to let you sword friends know that my sword domain has countless such swordsmen, countless such sword sects. We cannot forget them at any time. As long as we have their spirit, with their actions, why should we worry about not being able to take down the Dao sect? Why should we worry about not being able to defeat the sword tomb? Yes, we understand. All the swordsmen said in unison. Good. LV Ruochang pointed again and said, since the beginning of the Dao Cultivator War, this sword has been planning to set up a killing sword formation at the dragon-slaying slope where the Flying Dragon Sword sect swordsmen died, and kill the hundreds of thousands of Dao sect cultivators one by one. Now, this sword's wish is finally half completed. Those stupid Jurassic beast cultivators have indeed caught up. Right now, we are at the center of the great square sword formation that this sword has set up. And within a radius of 10 miles, is the first great formation of the great square sword formation, the Yin-Yang sword formation. Then, LV Ruochang pointed outside and said, outside the Yin-Yang sword formation is the second great formation, the 5-element splitting edge sword formation. Further outside is the third great formation, the spirit devouring formation. As for the outermost layer, it is a mysterious formation. This sword has not thought of a good name for it, but I believe that after today's killing, this great formation will have an extremely resounding name tomorrow. Chapter 2659. Good. Mu Ting and the others were delighted when they heard this and immediately cheered. My sword domain's several sword sects have already set up this great square sword formation. We're just waiting for the stupid cultivators to take the bait. Lu Ruochang clapped his hands and took out several sword slips and said, disciples of the various sword sects, you've already worked hard, there's no need to attack in the sword formation. The sword sect disciples who set up the formation will activate the sword formation according to the previous practice. However, I'd like to ask all of you, are you willing to sit there and watch the other sword sect disciples kill the enemy? Are you willing to be hunted down by the cultivators? Don't you want to take revenge for the disciples who died on the battlefield? Can you be like the Flying Dragon Sword sect 10,000 years ago, exhausting your last bit of sword origin and killing the last cultivator? We're willing to assist the disciples who set up the formation. All of the swordsmen's blood boiled as they said in unison. For the great victory of my sword domain, for the extermination of the Dao sect's cultivators, even if I have to crush all of your bones, even if I have to destroy all of your sword sects, can you be like the Flying Dragon Sword sect with no regrets? Lu Ruochang shouted again. We're willing to sacrifice ourselves for the victory of sword domain, with no regrets. All of the swordsmen shouted without hesitation. Good. Lu Ruochang clapped his hands and several sword slips flew into the hands of Ruo Ling, Mu Ting, and the other grade 3 illusory swordsmen. He said, sword friends, please lead the sword sect disciples to the 3 sword formations and kill the cultivators together with the other sword sect disciples. Yes, we'll obey. Zhu Qingye and the others received the sword slips and bowed. Then they used their divine sense to look at them and ordered their disciples to lead the various sword sects in different directions. Naturally, Ruo Ling and the others were a little puzzled by Lu Ruochang's arrangement at Dragon-Slaying Slope. They were even curious why Lu Ruochang suddenly brought forward the Flying Dragon Sword sect and asked all the disciples to imitate the Flying Dragon Sword sect and have no regrets even if the sect was destroyed. However, the situation was urgent at this time, and it was the key for the swordsmen to turn the tables. They only thought that LV Ruochang wanted to cover up his previous mistakes in command, so they didn't ask much. They flew everywhere according to LV Ruochang's instructions. Waiting until there were no more disciples in front of the dragon-slaying slope, LV Ruochang let out a long sigh. He raised his head and looked at the night sky. Although the night sky was pitch black, there were already traces of white light in the east. Obviously, dawn was coming. The rain is very heavy. It can wash away the blood and tears of the sword tomb. The wind is very strong. It can blow away the smoke of the sword tomb. However, although a long time has passed, it can't erase the hatred in the heart. Can the courage in the heart of a swordsman be washed away by time? LV Ruochang muttered to himself. Her voice was not loud and had long been drowned out by the sound of the rain. However, even though the sound of the rain was loud, it could not drown out the sound of hundreds of thousands of Dao sect cultivators chasing after her. Hearing the sound getting closer and closer, LV Ruochang's mouth revealed a trace of coldness. The sword aura around her body gradually appeared, and the flying sword under her feet also glowed. She flew up from the dragon-slaying slope and flew towards the other side of the yin-yang sword formation. And in front of her, the disciples of the Black Phoenix sword sect who had already flown away revealed their sword splendor. This sword splendor faintly shone in the night sky, as if some lanterns were floating in the air, pointing out the direction in the night. There, quick! Chase after them, kill all the swordsmen. After flying for a while, LV Ruochang stopped in the air and looked back. It seemed that there were arrogant figures of cultivators. LV Ruochang coldly looked at them. She clapped her hand and a green flying sword appeared in her hand. The green and green sword aura on the flying sword reflected on her face, revealing a trace of malevolence within the snow-white skin. Whoosh! LV Ruochang activated the sword origin. The flying sword faced the curtain of rain and rushed into the night sky. When it reached a high altitude, it let out a clear cry. It was actually a huge phoenix. This phoenix cry was extremely loud and clear, and it resounded in the surrounding dozens of miles. Looking at LV Ruochang, who was quietly standing on the dragon-slaying slope, her body glowed with sword light and she flew into the distance. On the dragon-slaying slope, other than the bright night rain, there were only the ruined purple jasmine flowers. It seemed that no one had ever stayed here. In the east, the sky was gradually turning white. It seemed that even the dawn was unwilling to be left out. It wanted to see this lively sword battle. The jade-green phoenix that charged into the sky naturally attracted the attention of hundreds of thousands of Dao sect cultivators. Heng Jie's heart sank and his divine sense hurriedly swept over. However, just like before, his divine sense was only able to sweep out a few hundred feet before it was restricted and couldn't reach far. Quick! Heng Zhao almost did not hesitate and turned to a disciple and shouted, "Turn around and go back." Before he could finish his sentence, he hurriedly looked to the side again. That disciple was a little confused and did not know what to do. He asked curiously, "Uncle Heng Ming, why are you turning around? Aren't you chasing after the sword cultivator?" Previously, when Li Zongbao was in the 10-direction annihilation spell, he did not activate the spell like the other disciples of the Utmost Happiness faction. Instead, he sat beside the spell and meditated. At this moment, when he was chasing after the sword cultivator, he accompanied Heng Zhao. When he heard Heng Zhao's order, he said calmly, "Master, don't worry. I will go ahead and check if I have fallen into the sword cultivator's ambush." Go and come back quickly." Heng Zhao was a little absent-minded. He waved his hand and flew up towards the huge flashing phoenix in front of him. "Yes." Li Zongbao bowed and turned to instruct the disciples on his left and right, "Leave 30% of the disciples behind. Stay where you are and do not follow the other disciples." The disciple who did not know what to do earlier had a stern look on his face. He hurriedly bowed in agreement and hurriedly passed down the order. Li Zongbao stretched out his hand and held the immortal piercing whip in his hand. He turned around and flew into the air, against the flow of hundreds of thousands of cultivators towards the back. LV Ruochang's phoenix flying sword condensed in the sky above the dragon-slaying slope and did not dissipate for a long time. In this slightly bright night sky it was so dazzling. This phoenix attracted the attention of hundreds of thousands of cultivators. The Qi refining and foundation establishment disciples did not dare to overtake it. Without the orders of the Golden Core Stage Masters, they still pushed forward in the formation. However, it was obvious that their flying speed was much slower. They were preparing to deal with the change. Fellow cultivator Heng Ming, De Sun flew over first and said anxiously, "There were still some traces of those sword cultivators who fled earlier. But in this moment, I did not even see a bit of sword light. Could it be?" Fellow cultivator De Sun, if you want to say that the slightest sound and the crane is scared out of its wits, it should be the sword cultivators. What does it have to do with us cultivators? Do you think that we have fallen into the ambush of the sword cultivators? Ji Hong snorted disdainfully. Wang Yi looked at the sword light in the sky in the distance. He bit his lips and said coldly, "When did these barbaric sword cultivators learn to mislead soldiers? Could it be that they think that a signal like a message can scare us?" Chapter 2660. Kill. Xiong Huasong said without hesitation, "I don't believe that a sword cultivator can silently set up another sword formation outside my 10-direction annihilation formation. If that's the case, wouldn't it be the biggest joke in the world?" Yes, Xiong Huasong didn't dare to believe it. Although this place was only 100 miles away from the 10-direction annihilation formation, if a sword cultivator made any movements here and set up a sword formation that could take down hundreds of thousands of cultivators, how could he not know? That's right, this is the empty city plan. In an instant, Heng Heng also made a decision and waved his hand. Disciples, kill, kill. When the disciples around Heng Heng heard the order, they all shouted in unison. This sound spread out and spread in waves. Close to 100,000 cultivators were shouting loudly, and the momentum was very threatening. Then, some of the hesitant cultivators once again increased their flying speed. However, even when they flew to the front of the dragon-punishing slope and pushed under the phoenix sword intent, they still didn't see any traces of the swordsman. Moreover, in the distance, it was also pitch black without a trace of sword brilliance. In addition, at this moment, it was the darkness before dawn. The previous trace of light had already disappeared, and the entire world was exceptionally dark. However, the torrential rain from before gradually lessened at this moment, and the rain began to fall intermittently. Heng Heng and the other golden core cultivators were also cautious at this time. First, they stopped the group of cultivators from advancing, and sent 100 or so Foundation Establishment late-stage disciples to fly forward to explore the path. Then Gao Wei, Xiong Huasong, and the others waved their hands and took out their magic treasures. Their figures flew straight into the sky, as if they wanted to explore the meaning of this huge phoenix. Heng Heng and the others looked at the figures of Xiong Huasong and the others while releasing their divine senses to carefully explore this extremely ordinary-looking slope. Boom, a loud sound rang out. Before Gao Wei and Xiong Huasong could fly close to this huge phoenix, the phoenix let out a deafening sound and turned into thousands of green sword lights, flying in all directions, clearly illuminating the surrounding several miles. Hundreds of thousands of Dao sect disciples formed a black mass within a radius of a couple of miles. They formed a spindle shape. Most of them were gathered near the dragon-punishing slope. There were quite a number of them extending forward in front of them. Behind them, there were over 10,000 people who remained at the same spot. They appeared to be very cautious. The green sword brilliance only shone for an instant, and in the next moment the entire dragon-slaying slope fell into darkness. Fellow Taoist Heng Ming de Sun frowned and said, "This matter is rather strange. We need to be careful. In this old man's opinion, why don't you stop while you're ahead?" Fellow Taoist de Sun. Ji Hong was a little unhappy. Just as she was about to say something, she suddenly heard a rumbling sound within 10 li of the dragon-punishing slope. The ground shook violently. Not good. Flying high in the sky, Gao Wei, who had just landed, immediately panicked and said anxiously, "Let's go quickly. I'm afraid we've fallen into a sword cultivator's ambush." "Shut up." When Heng Ming heard this, he roared angrily, "Disciples, listen to my command. Form the usual defensive formation." Yes, when the group of disciples first heard Gao Wei's words, they were very flustered and almost wanted to scatter and flee. However, when they heard Heng Ming's words, they suppressed the fear in their hearts. Each small team formed a formation, each sect formed a formation, and in a moment, everything stabilized. Gao Wei was humiliated in front of everyone. His face was burning, but he did not even have the courage to glare at Heng Ming, because his shout just now was indeed too abrupt. Rumble? The earth's shaking did not stop. Instead, wave after wave, it became more and more intense. Even at the place where the thousands of green sword brilliance disappeared, faint sword brilliance gradually emerged from the darkness and flashed from the horizon. This. Although Xiong Huasong did not land, his voice could be heard. He was almost in disbelief and shock. How is this possible? We've actually fallen into a sword cultivator's ambush? Xiong Huasong was not the only one who did not dare to believe it. All the golden core cultivators in the meeting hall did not dare to believe it. The changes in this battle were too unpredictable. Even in their wildest dreams, they did not expect that the swordsmen who were about to be killed by them would actually set up such a huge sword formation when they were in a desperate situation. They had opened their pockets and were waiting for them to come in. Moreover, what puzzled the hundreds of thousands of cultivators was that they had really come in. This must be a trick to mislead the troops. Ji Hong shouted without hesitation. Lu Ruochang has less than 70,000 swordsmen under his command. How can they surround hundreds of thousands of cultivators? How can they set up such a huge sword formation? However, at this point, this female cultivator who was incomparably touched by Qian Mo's words suddenly had a brilliant flash of light in her mind, like all the other golden core cultivators. Ji Hong was dumbfounded. While Hung Lu was shocked, he coldly glanced at Ji Hong and said indifferently, "Taoist Ji Hong, did you see that? I have already said that we shouldn't pursue a cornered enemy, but for the sake of Taoist Qian Mo's blood feud, we still chased after them." Ji Hong heard the reproach in Hung Lu's tone. How could she not understand what he meant? Just as she was about to retort, she heard Hengju's tone change. She wasn't a fool, so she gritted her teeth and said, "That's right, this old one also knows not to pursue a cornered enemy." At that time, if we had stopped, even if these sword cultivators had laid down this sword array, they definitely wouldn't have been able to succeed. But, if we didn't chase after them, how could we face our own conscience? How could we face Chen Mo, Li Qingshu, and the other Taoists who died? When Hung Lu heard this, his heart was slightly relieved. However, De Sun's face was heavy as he said, "Fellow Taoists, don't blame yourselves. Previously, I felt that the end of this battle was a little strange and couldn't figure out where the sword cultivators had gone. It was impossible that there were only the hundreds of thousands of disciples led by LV Ruochang and the others. Now their true purpose has been revealed. A portion of their disciples were setting up the sword formation in the sword tomb. They had set up an ambush here and were waiting to lure us in. From the looks of it, even if we don't take the bait this time, they will still have other ways to lure us in." Gao Wei hurriedly said, "This plan? I'm afraid that it had already started when we agreed on the 10-direction annihilation grand formation?" "That's right," Xiong Huasong nodded and said, "and this old man is sure that this sword formation must have been set before the 10-direction annihilation grand formation. Otherwise, this old man would have known about it." Hung Lu nodded. Daoist Xiong's words are reasonable. Moreover, Daoist Xiong's grand formation did not attract the attention of the sword cultivators. It is indeed Daoist Xiong's great merit. "It's nothing." Xiong Huasong was secretly proud and at the same time he said humbly, "Daoist Chen Mo's thoughts are actually the same as the sword cultivators. He is even more powerful." "That's right, that's why we have to avenge him at all costs." Hung Lu hurriedly added. "I'm afraid this is not the time to shirk responsibility." Li Jijie of the Changbai sect saw that the many golden core cultivators were actually not in a hurry to set up the formation and instead talked about the reason for the ambush. He couldn't help but say coldly, "Wait until we kill our way out of the sword formation, then it won't be too late to talk about other things." Hung Lu's face was slightly embarrassed, but he didn't care about Li Jijie's cold words. If he didn't explain clearly the responsibility of chasing and attacking, everyone would come to an agreement in their hearts. Even if he could lead the disciples of the Utopia faction to break out of the encirclement safely, he wouldn't feel at ease. The sword cultivators only have 70,000 people. They fell into our grand formation first and lost more than half of them. This so-called ambush and sword formation, I'm afraid it won't be intact. Ji Hong spoke again. "We only need to set up the formation to deal with them. Do you think we're afraid of them?" Xiang Ming of the Huanhua sect stood far away and didn't get too close. At this moment he also opened his mouth and said, "That's right, our Dao sect cultivators have more than 100,000 people. Just like the sword cultivators breaking through the formation, they are charging in the same direction. How can they not break out of the sword formation?" At this moment, a figure flew over and stopped in front of Hung Lu. It was Li Zongbao who had just flown back to check out the situation. "Zongbao, what's the situation?" Hung Lu raised his eyebrows and asked anxiously. "Reporting to master, senior uncles and senior uncles." Li Zongbao bowed and said, "The large group of people who came to kill the sword cultivators has been divided into two parts by the sword formation. The sword formation is green and red in color and is gradually taking shape. Golden chi and hurricanes are rising above the sword formation. I tried to charge through the sword light, but the sword chi inside is very strange. Every time, a green and red sword light attacked me, as if they were cooperating with each other. It's very powerful. I can't break out of the encirclement, so I don't know the situation of the other group of disciples." Hung Lu nodded. "This sound is also the sound of the sword formation?" "Yes." Li Zongbao answered. The green and red sword light was born from the ground of the sword tomb. It violently surged like a drum, and the ground within 100 feet collapsed. Many disciples tried to charge out before the collapse occurred, but they were all killed by the green and red sword light. Moreover, the collapse didn't stop when I came back. It seems that the sword formation's power is not small. Set up the formation. When Hung Lu heard that even Li Zongbao couldn't break through, he couldn't help but feel a chill in his heart. However, he snorted coldly. "Insignificant skill, you're really picking up the wisdom of others. We'll return now. Let's see how this sword formation can stop us." "Good." How could De Sun and the others not agree? They all clapped and praised. Hundreds of thousands of cultivators quickly arranged themselves into a formation in the shape of a sharp knife. However, hundreds of thousands of cultivators arranged themselves into a formation in the time it took to brew a cup of tea. During this time, the situation at the dragon-slaying slope changed again. The rumbling sound of the earthquake gradually approached from afar. Under the shaking of the ground, the purple jasmine flowers that couldn't be washed away by the heavy rain were all shaken off, leaving only the smooth purple flower stems. Looking at the green and red sword light that Li Zongbao mentioned, it soared into the sky from the ground in the distance, like a huge bonfire, surrounding hundreds of thousands of cultivators in an area of more than 10 miles. See. Hung Lu and the others' divine senses couldn't go very far, but they could see it clearly with their naked eyes. They couldn't help but gasp. Setting up a sword formation in such a large area, not to mention its power, the scale was probably much larger than the 10-direction annihilation formation. Chapter 2661. Hung Hing even looked at Xiong Huasong. After all, this sword formation was so close to the magic formation, how could Xiong Huasong not notice it? Xiong Huasong's face was also extremely ugly. This was really a slap to his face. Although the sword catacomb was incomparably dangerous and one's divine sense couldn't travel very far, but this was still a huge sword formation. It was right next to his magic formation. How could he not notice it? Could it be? Xiong Huasong suddenly had an idea in his mind. However, just as he was about to speak, there was a continuous rumbling sound. The vibration surrounding the dragon-slaying slope intensified and spread extremely quickly. It had already rushed to the feet of the hundreds of thousands of cultivators and reached the vicinity of the dragon-slaying slope. All disciples pay attention. Heng Ming said loudly, activate your magic power and advance towards where you came from. Boom. A huge sword cry directly suppressed Heng Heng's voice. At the place where the dragon-slaying slope was located, the ground of about 10 zhang had completely collapsed. 2 sword lights that were thicker than pillars rushed into the sky. That biting cold sword chi and soaring sword light immediately illuminated the area within dozens of li in a green and red color. These 2 sword lights, one crimson red and the other azure, were like pillars that reached the sky, piercing straight into the sky. Aha, welcome, welcome. From within the sword pillar, a loud and clear voice sounded. When the cultivators raised their heads to look, they saw that from within the crimson sword pillar, a red-faced, muscular middle-aged swordsman wearing a red sword robe appeared, holding a similarly crimson flying sword in his hand. Who are you? Heng Heng looked at this unfamiliar swordsman and coldly said, ha ha ha. That swordsman was still laughing. He took a step forward and flew out from the sword pillar, saying, this sword is the Supreme Harmony Sword Zhong Yang Jioding. A nobody. Looking at this second-grade illusory swordsman, Li Jijie coldly said, Hehe, if senior brother Yang is a nobody, then there is no need to talk about this sword. A laughter that sounded like a silver bell came from the azure sword formation. Following the flickering of a sword light, another petite and beautiful female swordsman wearing an azure sword formation flew out from the sword pillar. Junior sister Xiao. The corners of Yang Jioding's mouth curled into a smile as he said, the cultivators of the Dao sect have always been arrogant, and they look down on us swordsmen, not to mention us second-rate sword sects in the sword domain. However, they don't know any better, so we have to be polite. Junior sister, if you don't tell us your name, wouldn't they have died an unjust death when we kill them? Senior martial brother Yang's words make sense. The female swordsman chuckled and said, I am Xiojie of the Kuan sword sect. I'll be waiting for you. Don't forget my name when you reach the underworld. How dare you? Li Jijie scolded, you're just 2 grade 2 illusory swordsmen, yet you dare to brag here. Senior martial brother, let me take their heads. The 4 cultivators beside Li Jijie looked at each other and said in unison. Okay. Li Jijie nodded slightly when he saw that they were 4 disciples of the early stage of the Golden Core realm. When the 4 disciples saw that Li Jijie was doing the same, they waved their hands and the flying swords in their hands flashed with brilliance. They flew up and flew towards Yang Jioding and Xiojie who were leaning against the green and red sword pillars. The 4 of them had just flown a few feet when the brilliance around them flashed. 4 rays of sword light flashed with 4 colors. The sword chi rushed out of the flying swords and slightly intertwined in the air. It seemed that there was a strange connection between the 4 rays of sword light. The sword light began to rotate. When the 4 saw this, they shouted in unison, quick. Immediately after, the flying swords in their hands shot out. Each hand formed a sword seal, and the 4 flying swords suddenly accelerated like shooting stars piercing the sun. The 4 flying swords gave birth to 4 different forces. These forces were not only extremely sharp, but they also cooperated with each other, trapping Yang Jioding and Xiao Jie in an area of dozens of feet. As expected of the disciples of the Changbai sect. They actually used the Dharma array technique on their flying swords. Yang Jioding sneered. However, Dharma arrays are all Dharma arrays. The flying swords inside are just Dharma artifacts. How can they compare to the sword array of us swordsmen? As he spoke, Yang Jioding waved his hand very casually. It was like a fountain sprinkling a few drops of spring water. Several crimson sword lights pierced towards the 4 flying swords. However, when the crimson sword lights pierced a few feet in front of the flying swords, the 4 flying swords suddenly trembled and suddenly changed directions, stabbing towards Xiao Jie. Xiao Jie was originally smiling as he watched Yang Jioding deal with the 4 flying swords. However, when the 4 flying swords changed directions, the crimson sword beams missed. Xiao Jie couldn't help but raise his eyebrows. Seeing the 4 flying swords close in on him, he also pointed with his finger. Several azure sword beams flew out from the azure sword pillar to meet the 4 flying swords. Under the control of the 4 early-stage golden core cultivators, the 4 flying swords turned into 4 streams of light and fiercely pierced towards the green sword lights that looked like thin threads. Just as the azure sword light was about to collide with the 4 streaks of light, the several azure sword lights twirled slightly and turned into a dozen streaks of light. At the same time, the crimson sword light that had missed its target suddenly changed direction and pierced towards the 4 streaks of light at a speed several hundred times faster than before. Crack, 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 for crisp sounds could be heard as dozens of green-red sword silks circled around the 4 flying swords. These 4 flying swords of extraordinary quality were immediately sliced in half. Not good, the 4 flying swords were easily destroyed and the 4 early-stage golden core cultivators' minds were seriously injured. They didn't dare to attack anymore and turned around to fly back. "Where do you think you're going?" Yang Jioding shouted and pointed with his hand. A dozen rays of crimson sword lights fell from the sky and pierced towards the 4. Xiao Jie also controlled the green sword lights. A dozen rays of light circled around each other and pierced towards the 4 people like lightning. The 4 people were shocked and their souls almost flew out of their bodies. Humph! Li Jijie snorted coldly in midair. The flying sword in his hand flew out and turned into a golden light. It rushed towards the green and red sword lights like a coiling dragon. Good timing. Seeing Li Jijie's sword light surpass the 4 people and was about to hit the green and red sword light, another low voice came from the sword pillar. A short old man with a face full of wrinkles flew out from the sword pillar. This old man's body flashed with the same green and red brilliance. He waved his hand and punched the flying sword. The old man appeared so suddenly that Li Jijie didn't have time to react. With a ping sound, Li Jijie's flying sword was hit by the old man's fist. The flying sword emitted a jie sound and flew down diagonally. Not good. When Li Jijie's flying sword was hit, his mind was also shaken. However, when he controlled the flying sword, his gaze fell on the dozen rays of light piercing towards him. Sure enough, without waiting for the dozen or so cyan red sword lights to descend, the 4 of them clapped their hands together and 4 magic treasures flew out from their storage pouches. They were actually 4 identical shield-type defensive magic treasures. The 4 defensive magic treasures suddenly enlarged under the urging of the 4 people's magic power. They were now several feet in size and emitted a green-colored brilliance. This brilliance was extremely bright and protected the 4 people's bodies tightly. Moreover, it was very obvious that the brilliance of these 4 magic treasures lingered around each other and the fluctuations of spiritual power were also linked. It was just like they were used to cooperating. However, when the dozen rays of light fell on the green brilliance of the magic treasures, they immediately intertwined. The green brilliance also shook violently and fought with the sword light. However, what shocked the 4 people was that this sword light was extremely different from the sword light they had encountered before. In the fight, it actually avoided the important part and focused on the trivial. It was like a strange tentacle that wandered around, as if it was looking for the weakness of the magic treasures. While the 4 people activated their magic treasures to defend, they quickly descended. However, at this moment they heard Xiao Jie sneer in their ears. The 4 people felt a chill in their hearts. Sure enough, following the sneer, a thin green sword light pierced into the gap between the 2 magic treasures that appeared in an instant. At the same time, another thin crimson sword radiance appeared along with the azure sword radiance in an even more bizarre manner. Fight! The heart of the golden core disciple closest to the 2 sword lights tightened. With a flick of his hand, several rays of spiritual power appeared and a series of seals appeared to block the sword lights. Puff puff puff. The green and red sword lights crisscrossed in the air and streaked across like lightning. The defensive seals that the golden core disciple used were all pierced by the sword lights. Not good. When the disciple saw this, he was even more shocked. The spiritual power in his body surged and golden light shined around him as if he was activating a magic treasure to protect his body. Li Jijie also hurriedly pointed with his finger again. The flying sword that was knocked away paused for a moment before slashing toward the dozen rays of green and red sword lights. The 2 rays of green and red sword lights that penetrated the magic treasure were especially fast. The moment the magic treasure appeared, the sword light landed on the disciple's body. It was like a silk thread that wrapped around the disciple's neck. The sword light wrapped around the early-stage golden core cultivator's neck. The protective magic treasure glowed with an extremely resplendent brilliance, and this brilliance flashed violently. However, in front of Li Jijie and the hundreds of thousands of Dao sect cultivators, the golden light protecting the golden core cultivator was instantly annihilated. The golden core cultivator's head flew up and a pillar of blood spurted high into the air. At this time, Li Jijie's sword light had just touched the dozen rays of green and red sword light. This time the weapon cultivator who suddenly attacked didn't attack. He just stood in the air and laughed. The dozen rays of sword light seemed to have intelligence. The moment they touched Li Jijie's sword light, they immediately dodged and flew into the green and red sword pillar and disappeared. Li Jijie's flying sword actually hit nothing. Damn it. When Li Jijie saw that one of his Changbai sect's golden core disciples had been killed and his attack had failed, he was shocked and enraged. Since Li Jijie and the other golden core cultivators were shocked, how could the hundreds of thousands of foundation establishment and chi refinement cultivators not be scared? Chapter 2662. Idiot. Seeing that Li Jijie was about to go into battle, Hung Feng couldn't help but curse in his heart. He flew out and said, "Fellow Taoist Li, look at the big picture. Don't mess up your formation. There are tens of thousands of sword lights, hundreds of thousands of sword cultivators. Although you and I are golden core cultivators, it won't be easy to deal with them." When Li Jijie heard this, he snorted coldly and stopped in the air. His eyes were fixed on the corpse of that disciple and the other 3 disciples who had landed beside him with shocked expressions. Where did this sword cultivator come from? How dare he launch a sneak attack without announcing his name? Hung Feng looked at the old man with a strange glow around him and knew that this old man was a weapon cultivator. As expected, the old man showed a trace of arrogance and said, "I am Meng Changsho from the Flying Feathers sect." "You're also a nobody," Hung Feng said indifferently. "Although I'm a nobody, I can do things that will shock the world." Meng Changsho's expression changed slightly and he sneered, "After this battle, my name will definitely resound throughout the 3 cultivation countries." "Haha, with just the sword formation?" Hung Feng laughed loudly and then looked at the east where the sky had already turned white amidst the drizzling rain. He said, "Did the sun rise from the west today?" Formations have always been the ultimate technique that our Dao sect cultivators rely on. When did it become a weapon that sword cultivators use to attack our Dao sect? Caw, another clear cry was heard. This cry sounded like that of a bird, yet it wasn't. It was extremely ear-piercing. Many aura-refining disciples who heard this cry felt as if their hearts were being pricked by needles, causing them to lose their footing. An old man wearing a strange gray robe flew out from the other side of the sword pillar. He had a flat round head, large eyes, and 2 of his eyes emitting a faint grayish-yellow light. Looking at this old man's slightly pointed nose and long eyelashes, as well as the fine and thick feathers on his face, all the cultivators knew that this old man must be a bird cultivator. So, these nondescript heretical cultivators have all come to the sword catacomb to set up formations. Hung Feng seemed to have understood something. "I am Li Ying of the Kunmu Valley. I have been ordered by Lu Ruochang to set up this great sword formation. I have been waiting for you for a long time." The old man's voice was sharp and he quickly finished speaking in one breath. He spoke so quickly that Heng Ming was stunned. It took him several breaths to react. Heng Zhao rolled his eyes and raised his voice. "Where is Lu Ruochang? Is she hiding just like that? Does she not dare to meet her old friend?" What old friend? We are enemies. LV Jinyu is the best strategist among the warriors of the sword domain. As long as she commands us, we will naturally fight to the death. Why do we need her to come and see you?" Li Ying said in a clear voice. Heng Heng laughed coldly. "She's probably scared by this old man's array, isn't she? You've become a coward." At this point, Heng felt that it was inappropriate. If this was the 3 kingdoms of cultivation, all the cultivators would be furious at the mention of a coward. However, There was no lack of beast cultivators in the Hun kingdom. The old man in front of him looked like an owl or a parrot. Who would care about being a coward? Sure enough, Li Ying did not care. He said coldly, "All this nonsense is useless. We have set up a sword formation here in the sword catacomb. You and I will meet in the sword formation. You only need to break the sword formation and LV Jianyu will definitely face you." As he spoke, Li Ying's gray sword robes flapped as if he was about to fly away. "Li Ying, I am Xiong Huasong of the Black Heaven sect." Xiong Huasong would not let go of the opportunity to ask. He hurriedly stepped forward and asked, "Let me ask you, what is the name of your sword formation? You want to know the name of this sword formation?" Li Ying stopped. A strange light flashed in his grayish-yellow eyes. "That's right." Xiong Huasong nodded. "What is the name of the great formation that your Dao sect set up earlier?" Li Ying asked hesitantly. "That great formation is my Black Heaven sect's 10-direction annihilation formation," Xiong Huasong replied without hesitation. Li Ying's eyelids twitched rapidly. Then he replied, "Haha, I'm not afraid to tell you. This is the Yin-Yang sword formation. If you have any tricks up your sleeves, feel free to use them. I'd like to see how you'll break the formation." "When was this sword formation set up?" Xiong Huasong quickly asked. "Heck, when was your 10-direction annihilation formation set up?" Li Ying clearly wanted to know when the Dao sect set up the formation in the sword catacomb. Xiong Huasong hesitated for a moment. He glanced at Heng Heng and said, "It was only a few months ago." "A few months ago?" Li Ying was extremely surprised. They had been setting up the formation for several years under LV Ruochang's orders and had finally completed it. They were just waiting for LV Ruochang and the rest to lure the Dao sect cultivators into the formation. However, a 10-direction annihilation formation had suddenly appeared beside the four-corner sword formation. To be honest, Li Ying and the rest were even more surprised than Xiong Huasong and the rest. They wanted to know when the Dao sect cultivators had set up the great formation. Of course, Li Ying and the rest also understood that the sword cultivators had been suppressing the Dao sect's attacks. The battle lines had already penetrated deep into the country of Shi and the country of Lian. They had never expected the Dao sect cultivators to set up a formation in the sword catacomb. Therefore, the defense in the sword catacomb was very lax. Furthermore, the sword catacomb's terrain was very special. They could not possibly detect every single movement in the sword catacomb. They could not possibly detect any strange movements in the sword catacomb. After all, strange movements were normal in the sword catacomb. If it was normal, it would be abnormal. Whose idea was it? Li Ying asked faster than frying beans. "Qian." Xiong Huasong replied without hesitation. Heng Ming asked anxiously, "When did you set up the sword formation?" "It won't be too late to ask after you answer this question." We have been setting up the formation here for more than 8 years under LV Jianyu's orders." Li Ying snorted coldly. Eight years. Heng Ming looked at Xiong Huasong. Xiong Huasong's eyes clearly revealed a sense of relief. "Forget it." Heng Ming sighed. "Now it seems that our previous victories in the Spirit Stone Mine and other places were all part of your plan? You wanted to lure us into the ambush in the sword catacomb? We are not very clear about the battle on the front lines." Li Ying did not hide anything and said proudly, "Those were all done by LV Ruochang and LV Jianyu. We were only waiting here for you to fall into the trap and kill you all." As the saying goes, the onlooker sees more clearly. Although Heng Ming and the others were involved in the planning of the great battle of Dao cultivators, when they turned their heads to look at the situation of the battle, they were like onlookers again. Many details were clear at a glance and were far more clear than when they were sitting in the meeting hall of Sky Patrol City talking nonsense. Only when they heard that the Yin-Yang sword formation had been set up for more than 8 years did Heng Ming and the others truly realize that the sword cultivators of the Han Kingdom were not as weak as they thought. They had planned for a long time. At the same time, Heng Ming and the others were extremely emotional as they thought of two people, Tu Hong and Chen Mo. Both of them had already fallen and were not regarded as cultivators in their eyes. If it wasn't for Tu Hong's arrogant wish to create another Golden Spring Mountain in the Sword Tomb, and Chen Mo's close relationship with Tu Hong due to Dui Qiming's matter, he would have selflessly mentioned it in the meeting hall and had his own ideas. If it wasn't for this, the Dao sect cultivators would never have thought of setting up a formation in the Sword Tomb, let alone a 10-direction annihilation formation. However, the cultivators' indifferent actions actually brought them a pleasant surprise. If not for Heng Ming's greed and Ji Hong's arrogance in killing the sword cultivators, the Dao sect would have almost won this time and this great battle of Dao cultivators would almost be over. but the Tao of Heaven was clear. Because of Heng Ming and the others' greed, they had fallen into the sword formation that LV Ruochang had painstakingly set up for 8 years. After hearing Li Ying's words, Heng Ming and the others already knew that this yin-yang sword formation was not something that the sword formations they had encountered previously could compare to. Indeed, with a long cry from Li Ying, the green and red sword pillars shone brightly and covered the figures of Xiu Jie, Yang Jioding, Meng Changshou and the others. Within the large formation, within a radius of 10 miles, where the earth had trembled previously, there were now flashing sword lights. These sword lights were only green and red, and they were like bamboo shoots after the rain shooting out from the ground. Disciples, Heng Ming hurriedly ordered. Kill. Kill. The disciples heard the order and shouted in unison. That shout reverberated throughout the large formation, and the fear from before seemed to have dissipated significantly. At the same time as Heng Ming gave the order, the green and red sword pillars flashed. The green and red sword lights split into thousands of sword lights and sprayed in all directions like a skyrocketing fountain. The sword lights that drilled out from the ground also let out sword cries and rushed into the air. They formed a joint attack with the sword lights of the sword pillars and pierced towards the cultivators from above and below. Not only that, the sword lights that Li Zongbao had seen previously absorbed the surrounding spiritual energy of heaven and earth and the sword intents of many remnant swords from dozens of miles away, attacking the hundreds of thousands of cultivators trapped in the center from all directions. Xiong Huasong saw the power of the yin-yang sword formation and could not help but gasp. He thought to himself, this sword formation is not much inferior to the metal destruction formation. Although the sword lights had yet to reach the cultivators, the wind and clouds in the entire large formation changed drastically. Sword chi swept out like a huge beast's mouth, swallowing everyone. The green and red sword lights were the fangs of the ferocious beast. Although the thousands of green and red sword lights could not be compared to the yin-yang sword lights released by second-grade illusory swordsmen like Xiu Jie and Yang Jioding, their power was definitely not to be underestimated. Attack! In the blink of an eye, the yin-yang sword lights pierced towards the cultivators. How could the formation that the cultivators had formed dare to be careless? They hurriedly channeled their magic power and took out their magic weapons and treasures. Tens, hundreds, and even thousands of treasures flashed and smashed towards the green and red sword lights. Rumble! Within the sword formation, the first rumble was heard. Then the rumbles continued to explode, one after another, each louder than the last. The dozens of disciples of the Black Heaven sect formed a strange formation. After they took out their magic weapons, flames soared into the sky and hundreds of huge fireballs hit the sword light that was coming from above. Chapter 2663. Pa pa pa. A series of explosions rang out in the air like firecrackers lit by children. The moment the 100 or so fireballs came into contact with the sword light, they were all sliced apart by the green and red sword light. They couldn't stop the sword light from penetrating deeper. However, at the same time that the fireballs exploded, the brilliance of the sword light also dimmed, and the sword chi also weakened. A series of blood-curdling screams came from the Clear Leaf sect disciples. The green and red sword light had broken through the formation of more than 10 chi refinement disciples. The green and red sword light cut through the necks, waists, and even legs of these disciples as if they were weeding grass. Whenever the green and red sword light flashed past the bodies of these disciples, their bodies would be sliced open by the sword light. As blood spurted out, their corpses also fell from the sky. Illusion? Right, illusion. A mid-foundation establishment disciple saw that he couldn't block the red sword light that was slashing between his brows and felt his soul leave his body. However, when the sword light fell, he didn't sense any abnormalities. He immediately understood that the countless green and red sword lights that covered an area of several kilometers weren't all sword lights. Some of them were illusions of the sword formation. However, just as this disciple shouted, 2 more sword lights flew over in pairs. The disciple hastily activated his magic treasure to block them. However, a thin crack appeared on his magic treasure from the sword light. It was obviously not an illusion. Thus, the disciple became extremely depressed. That's right, even if you know that there are illusions in the sword light, so what? Can you not use your magic power to block each sword light? Moreover, even if you used all your strength to resist, how many yin-yang sword lights can you resist? The yin-yang sword formation quickly closed up, and the green and red sword lights wantonly crisscrossed. These sword lights were like scythes, reaping the lives of chi refinement cultivators one after another. Their magic treasures and talismans couldn't block these incomparably sharp sword lights at all. These green and red sword lights were also incomparably cruel. Most of them cut through the cultivators' necks. Apart from a small number of cultivators who could barely dodge and scream before they died, the rest of the cultivators had their heads chopped off without a sound. Blood soared into the sky. Thus, not long after, nearly 20% of the Qi refinement disciples among the hundreds of thousands of cultivators lost their lives. The pungent smell of blood permeated the entire formation. The drizzling rain couldn't wash away this vicious stench of blood at all. Moreover, countless drops of blood flowed into the ground of the sword tomb along with the rain. The purple jasmine flowers that were washed by the rain earlier became even more beautiful. Sure enough, a sword formation couldn't be compared to a formation. In fact, the two were completely different. The formation used the formation to condense the dermic powers of the disciples to form a powerful attack. This attack focused on the overall power of the formation. On the other hand, a sword formation combined the sword lights of a group of swordsmen. They interacted and strengthened each other, forming an even more powerful sword light and sword qi. This sword formation emphasized a kind of naked slaughter. Dozens of people from the Huanhua sect formed a formation. A group of Foundation Establishment and Qi Refinement disciples activated their magic treasures, and a huge, thick, green-colored tree, about 10 zhang long, formed in the air with a rumble. The surrounding spiritual energy of heaven and earth spun violently and was sucked into the green-colored tree formed by many magic treasures. Wu, the green tree flashed around the group of disciples, blocking the 10 or so sword lights of yin and yang. Under their combined efforts, the huge green tree slowly smashed into the ground. Boom! Hundreds of green and red sword lights rushed out from the ground and pierced into the green tree. While the runes on the surface of the green tree were corroded, they also blocked the sword lights. Under the heavy pressure and confinement, the sword lights curved. As the green tree fell to the ground, a huge roar erupted. At the same time, the cries of swords rang out endlessly. When the greenwood splendor rushed into the ground, circles of green splendor violently overflowed. It actually struck the swords until they dimmed and many of them even disappeared. Seeing that the attack was effective, the disciples of the Huanhua sect almost cheered in unison. However, just as they were about to activate their mana again with a smile on their faces, more than 10 rays of green-red sword light flew towards them from the side. They slanted and were about to stab into the formation they had formed. In this yin and yang sword formation, the green and red yin and yang sword lights were like fish in water. Every time two green and red sword lights interacted, their speed was extremely fast. Moreover, there were many sword lights crisscrossing each other. Who would be able to distinguish them in time? By the time the crowd could distinguish the 10 or so sword lights, they were already in front of them. The Foundation Establishment disciples in the formation were better off. They hurriedly activated the flying spell and tried their best to dodge. However, the aura refining disciples had just activated their vital qi. Now that they hurriedly activated their flying talismans, they were not as agile as the Foundation Establishment disciples. There was not much space for them to dodge. As the 10 or so sword lights flashed, another 10 or so lives were lost. The 10 or so aura refining disciples were scared out of their wits. Their faces were ashen, and the joy from before was still frozen on their faces. Their eyes flashed with infinite terror. Caught at this critical moment, the crisp cry of a phoenix sounded from the left side of the disciples. Then a thin azure blue screen quickly spread out from the side of the disciples. A voice that was very similar to the cry of a phoenix said crisply, "Don't look at this primordial water. Focus on defeating the enemy." The dozens of sword lights rushed into the thin blue screen, but they only managed to penetrate an inch deep before they were disintegrated by the Daos like rays of light that shot into a polygonal crystal. All the Daos disappeared. Thank you, Senior Sister Hong Xia. The 10 or so Foundation Establishment and aura refining disciples were overjoyed when they heard this voice. They obediently moved their divine senses and gazes away from the thin screen. With a cheer, they formed a formation again and slowly activated their magic power. Looking at the side of the crowd, Fairy Hong Xia was wearing a crimson-red robe. She released the phoenix celestial body that was 10 feet in size. The ice phoenix was controlling the innate primordial water to protect the crowd. Xiao Hua defeated Ji Yi in the Seven Extremes Ridge as a nameless person and forced Ruasi to retreat with hundreds of thousands of swordsmen. The thunder-controlling sect, Huanhua sect, and other Dao sect disciples occupied the Seven Extremes Ridge's Spirit Stone mine. Then, under the command of the Sky Patrol City's conference hall, Fairy Hong Xia and the others attacked the swordsmen who were not too far away under Mingyu's leadership. Then, when the swordsmen were defeated, they chased them to the Sword Tomb. As for the Imperial Thunder Sect, because Qin Sheng had seen Wu Ming's so-called Imperial Thunder Shock with his own eyes, he was sent back to the Imperial Thunder Sect for questioning. The disciples of the Imperial Thunder Sect did not stop at the Seven Extremes Mountains. Instead, they were sent to the Clear Cave. In the Sword Tomb, the Huanhua sect was in charge of the Ice Destruction Array. Because Fairy Hong Xia had the Ice Phoenix celestial body and her physique was of the ice element, she was more effective in the array than the ordinary Foundation Establishment disciples. Even the Golden Core cultivator Ming Yu stayed by Fairy Hong Xia's side to protect her. Of course, Fairy Hong Xia did not disappoint. She played a great role in killing the Huanjin sect. When the sword cultivators broke the formation and retreated in defeat, Fairy Hong Xia finally felt relieved. She knew that the battle was over. She had contributed a lot to Huanhua. She was overjoyed. She was thinking about how to tell Ming Yu and let Xiao Hua accompany her to the ancestral home of the Kai clan. Unfortunately, Fairy Hong Xia's joy was only for a moment. Many Huanhua sect disciples flew out of the array and went deep into the Sword Tomb to chase after the defeated sword cultivators. Fairy Hong Xia did not know what others were thinking, but she was extremely unwilling to chase after them. Not to mention the dangers of the Sword Tomb, the results of the Ice Destruction Array were enough to satisfy her. Moreover, Fairy Hong Xia knew the principle of not chasing after a cornered enemy. Unfortunately, Fairy Hong Xia was only a disciple in the late Foundation establishment stage. Even Ming Yu, who was beside her, did not have the chance to speak. What could she do? When the hundreds of thousands of cultivators entered the Yin-Yang sword formation, Fairy Hong Xia was also burning with anxiety. While she defended against the enemy with Ming Yu, her beautiful eyes looked around, desperately trying to find traces of Xiao Hua. She knew that in such a dangerous situation, only her lover Xiao Hua could protect her, right? Speaking of Xiao Hua, Fairy Hong Xia felt an indescribable sweetness in her heart. Besides this sweetness, there was also a trace of bitterness. She wanted to see Xiao Hua now, but she did not want Xiao Hua to appear now. The reason was simple. Ever since the Seven Extremes Mountains, Fairy Hong Xia had no news of Xiao Hua. She also did not see Li Zongbao and Xiao Mao. However, the tidal beads and connate primordial water that Xiao Hua gave her had saved her life many times, ensuring that she would be fine in the battle. As for Fairy Hong Xia's magic treasure, Crimson Drill, it had been damaged by Yun Bai in the Seven Extremes Mountains. Although it had recovered a lot after some simple refinement, it was not very useful in this battle. Every time Fairy Hong Xia used the connate primordial water, she would think of her lover and her heart would be filled with sweetness. However, ever since the Seven Extremes Mountains battle, Ming Yu, who had a good impression of Fairy Hong Xia, took care of Fairy Hong Xia even more because of Fairy Hong Xia's performance. What made Fairy Hong Xia unhappy was that this golden core female cultivator, who regarded her as a direct descendant, would occasionally talk to her about the non-existent John Doe. She did not seem to look down on John Doe because of his looks. Instead, her tone was full of admiration. With Fairy Hong Xia's intuition as a female cultivator, she could even feel that Ming Yu had feelings for John Doe. Of course, although Fairy Hong Xia's cultivation and age could not be compared to Ming Yu's, she was born in an aristocratic family and had the fate of being together with Xiao Hua. She was not inferior to Ming Yu in matters of love. She also knew that this was just a feeling that was dispensable. If she did not have the chance to interact with John Doe, this feeling would not be considered a feeling at all. However, if she had the chance to interact with John Doe, this feeling could immediately turn into a web of love. Therefore, Fairy Hong Xia did not know whether to laugh or cry. Chapter 2664. As a female cultivator, Fairy Hong Xia already had a knot in her heart regarding Xiao Hua and Xue Xue. She had never seen Xue Xue, but she had heard Xiao Hua mention her before. She had even secretly inquired about her before. However, Xiao Hua had already made it clear to her. The intelligent Fairy Hong Xia knew that Xiao Hua had already made up his mind. She must not be jealous and make Xiao Hua unhappy. This would be inappropriate for her, Xiao Hua, and even Xue Xue. Secondly, when Xue Xue confessed, she was not by Xiao Hua's side. She had not even confessed her love to Xiao Hua. From this point of view, Xue Xue's courage to love and hate was much stronger than hers. She could only let Xue Xue take the initiative. Thirdly, Xue Xue was also a disciple of Imperial Thunder sect. Fairy Hong Xia understood the principle of the pavilion closest to the water enjoys moonlight first. This was something she could not achieve. Besides, with Xue Xue by Xiao Hua's side, Fairy Hongxia could rest assured that no other female cultivator would interfere with her relationship with Xiaohua. Fourth, she had the fate of being together with Xiaohua first. Xiaohua had also said clearly that in Xiaohua's heart, she was much more important than Xue Xue. From this point of view, Fairy Hongxia knew that Xiaohua, who had always valued friendship, would treat her well, even better than Xue Xue. Based on the above thoughts, Fairy Hongxia could accept this Xue Xue who had an opportunity that she could not have. She had also made up her mind to get along with her in the future. But for this sudden appearance of Mingyu, she definitely felt more pressure than a mountain. This was a golden core cultivator, and Fairy Hongxia also vaguely knew that Nameless was the first male cultivator that Mingyu, a golden core cultivator, was prepared to accept in her heart. If Mingyu really had the idea of dual cultivation with Nameless, Fairy Hongxia did not know how to kill this idea. What made Fairy Hongxia the most bitter was that Mingyu's Nameless was not real. This Nameless was her lover, Xiaohua. What made Fairy Hongxia feel the most incredulous was that Mingyu, a Jindan stage teacher, would mention her lover in front of her. Every time she talked about John Doe, the shyness and admiration in her eyes were purer than that of a 16-year-old girl. Furthermore, Fairy Hongxia could only follow Mingyu's thoughts and talk to her intimately. Of course, Fairy Hongxia would also attack Mingyu from time to time, talking about John Doe's appearance and his short stature. That damned enemy. I don't know where he ran off to. He shouldn't be here. Fairy Hongxia saw that the interior of the yin-yang sword array was filled with dazzling lights. The sword beams and magic treasures were locked in an intense battle. From time to time, there would be loud explosions. However, she did not see any familiar figure. She could not help but grit her teeth fiercely. Her fine white teeth seemed to have bitten into Xiaohua's chest. Sure enough, right next to her, there was a round disc that looked like a moon. It was Mingyu's magic treasure, Mingyu. At the same time, Mingyu's melancholy voice sounded, "Alas, what a pity. I wonder where senior brother Nameless is. If he was here, he would probably be able to break this array, right? Don't you agree, Martial niece Hongxia?" Yes. If that old man was here, he would definitely be captured easily. Fairy Hongxia bit the word old man heavily, just like how she bit Xiaohua fiercely. Mingxiu, be careful. It was just that, just as Fairy Hongxia was about to bite off a piece of Xiaohua's flesh, two extremely strange green and red sword beams streaked across the sky. Those who were hit by the sword beams all had their heads separated from their bodies. It was truly powerful. And these two sword beams were sweeping towards Ji Mingxiu and the rest who were not too far away from Fairy Hongxia. Fairy Hongxia's warning was still a little too late. Ji Mingxiu and 3 other Foundation establishment disciples who were on good terms with Fairy Hongxia had joined forces to deal with the other sword beams. Not to mention that they did not hear Fairy Hongxia's warning. Even if they did, they would not be able to dodge in time. Fairy Hongxia did not dare to be careless. Without releasing her Phoenix Dharma body, she activated the tidal bead within her Dharma body. A stream of Khanate primordial water flew out and turned into a water screen the size of a palm, blocking in front of Ji Mingxiu and the rest. Swoosh, with a soft sound, the 2 sword beams sank into the Khanate primordial water. But what shocked Fairy Hongxia was that the 2 sword beams were not disintegrated by the Khanate primordial water. In fact, the 2 sword beams only changed their direction after entering the Khanate primordial water. Then they suddenly pierced towards Fairy Hongxia. Get out of the way. Mingyu was right beside Fairy Hongxia. Seeing that the Khanate primordial water was unable to block the green and red sword beams, she hurriedly shouted. The bright moon that was flying above her head shot out diagonally. The bright moon was like a round disc, emitting a bright moonlight, blocking in front of Fairy Hongxia. Kacha. With a crisp sound, the green and red sword beams hit the magic treasure, Mingyu. The bright moon flashed and the 2 sword beams flashed. The light on the bright moon dissipated, and a small crack appeared on the magic treasure. Hiss, Mingyu saw that the magic treasure was damaged, and the 2 sword beams were gradually disappearing. She could not help but gasp. How can these 2 sword beams be so powerful? Martial Aunt Mingyu. Fairy Hongxia did not have time to thank her. She hurriedly said, "From what I see, the sword beams in this yin-yang sword formation are not the same. These 2 sword beams are the same as the ones that killed the Changbai sect Golden Core seniors. And the green and red sword beams that we encountered earlier should be from the swordsmen who set up the formation. They are not the same as these 2 sword beams." Mingyu's eyes flashed, reflecting the green and red sword beams. She turned to look at the center of the sword formation, at the 2 green and red sword pillars. She said, "That's right. These two sword pillars are the eye of the sword formation. The green and red sword beams attracted the sword beams of the swordsmen who set up the formation. Maybe there are only two sword beams in the sword pillars and the rest are illusions. As long as we destroy these two sword pillars, the yin-yang sword formation should be broken. Even if we can't break it, the rest of the green and red sword beams can be dealt with by the formations of the Foundation Establishment and Qi Refining Disciples. It is 100 times stronger than the yin-yang sword light that only Jindan stage seniors can defend against, and the green and red sword light that ordinary swordsmen can defend against. It is even mixed with some illusions, making it impossible to distinguish between reality and illusion. Fairy Hong Xia also came to a realization. Let's go and report to Senior Xiang Ming. Ming Yu looked up and saw Heng Li, Xiang Ming, and the other golden core cultivators of the conference hall working together, flying in front of the group of disciples. Heng Li and the rest were not the first to retreat, but they had the same idea as LV Ruochang. First, they worked together at the edge of the yin-yang sword formation to create an opening, allowing the group of Dao sect disciples to escape from the sword formation. Heng Heng and the others activated their own Dharma treasures and flew in front of them. The storm-like green and red sword lights landed on their Dharma treasures but were unable to cause any ripples. They were all destroyed by the Dharma treasures. Occasionally the true yin and yang sword lights would hit their Dharma treasures, but they only managed to break a little of the Dharma treasures' defense, which would be repaired by other Dharma treasures moments later. They were far from being able to cause any damage to them. Of course, as Heng Li and the rest flew to the edge of the sword formation, they were also paying attention to the situation within the sword formation. Seeing how bloody the yin-yang sword formation was, Heng Li whispered, "Fellow Taoists, we need to speed up. This yin-yang sword formation is too cruel. The green and red sword beams are split into yin and yang, and the sword chi seems to have some special effect. When the two sword beams combine into one, the power is far greater than two. It is especially useful for destroying the defensive light of our cultivators. Any disciple below mid-foundation establishment stage can't resist at all. At this moment, they can only rely on their combined attacks and formation techniques to fight back. Once they run out of magic power, they won't be able to use the sword formation. Not to mention borrowing the power of the sword formation. Even if a swordsman rushed out and fought with us face to face, we disciples would not be a match for him." Yes, fellow Taoist Heng Ming is right. Li Jijia controlled his flying sword. After clashing with the sword beams of the yin-yang sword formation a few times, he also gained some insight. He replied, "With the sword formation, sword cultivators can defeat many and break this sword formation. Sword cultivators don't have anything to rely on. We can advance or retreat and we can maintain our victory." This. De Sun's tone was a bit hesitant. He whispered, "I have a bad feeling." Heng Li frowned and asked, "Could it be that fellow Taoist De Sun is thinking the same thing as I? Is it the yin-yang sword beam that killed the Changbai sect disciples just now?" De Sun didn't answer Heng Li directly. Instead he asked, "Fellow Taoist Heng Ming, are you saying that the sword beam that even golden core cultivators can't resist is placed at the edge of the sword formation to block our way out?" Heng Heng looked above his head and saw the sword lights flying out from the two sword pillars. Like a fountain, they connected with the green-red sword lights dozens of miles away and enveloped him and the others. He nodded and said, "That's right. This is what I'm worried about. Xiujie and the others who set up the formation must have placed extremely powerful flying swords at the edge of the sword formation to prevent us from breaking the formation and returning." I's worry isn't limited to that. De Sun sighed. "We saw it just now. Other than the yin-yang sword beam that killed the Changbai sect's golden core cultivators, we haven't seen many sword beams as powerful as this. Most of the flying swords in this sword formation can only kill cultivators below mid-foundation establishment stage. What about cultivators above early foundation establishment stage? Do they rely on those rare yin-yang sword beams?" Hiss. Although the group of golden core cultivators failed in their plan, their thoughts were not bad. They immediately sucked in a breath of cold air and almost all understood. Heng Ming said anxiously, "Could it be that fellow Taoist De Sun is saying that LV Ruochang has set up other sword formations besides this yin-yang sword formation? This sword formation can kill mid-foundation establishment stage, late foundation establishment stage, and even golden core cultivators?" "That's right. LV Ruochang and the others have been setting up this sword formation for more than 8 years. If it wasn't for a sword formation that could kill golden core cultivators in the conference hall, would she need to rack her brains? She only needs to fight us in the state of Shi and the state of Lien." De Sun felt that his premonition was right. Chapter 2665. Heng Zhao was even more hesitant and almost stopped. He asked hesitantly, "Are we not going to break the array?" "Master." Li Zongbao was not far from Heng Ju. When he saw Heng Ju hesitate, he hurriedly sent a voice transmission. "We can't hesitate now. Even if sword cultivators have many tricks up their sleeves, I have to deal with every move that comes my way. Let's break this array first." "That's right." Heng Zhao's heart skipped a beat. He cursed himself for being foolish and hurriedly added, "Even if the sword cultivators have such an arrangement, we have to break this yin-yang sword array first and let the disciples rush out." "Good." The group of cultivators saw Heng Zhao's decision and knew that this was the only way, so they all sped up. "Zongbao." Heng Zhao's heart was still beating fast. He transmitted his voice in a low voice, "I'm not sure what to do now. Do you have any ideas? You should have told me earlier. This battle is not only about the victory of our sect, but also the fate of our Utopia faction." "I understand." Li Zongbao hurriedly replied. Then he transmitted his voice again, "Also, I have an idea." "Say it." Heng Zhao hurriedly asked, "If you have any ideas in the future, tell me immediately." "Yes." Li Zongbao did not dare to delay and continued, "In breaking arrays, the strongest point has always been the flaw. Previously, LV Ruochang used this method to break my golden destruction array." "That's right." Heng Zhao was shocked again. He turned his head slightly and looked at the sword pillars that were already far away. He transmitted his voice, "Zongbao, you said that these two sword pillars are the most powerful part of the yin-yang sword array. Then, they should be the eye of this yin-yang sword array, right?" "Yes." Li Zongbao replied honestly, "What I think is that these sword pillars must be the eye of the array. I'm sure all the Golden Core stage masters know this too. However, Xiujie and the others used these sword pillars to kill a Golden Core stage martial uncle at the beginning. This makes people feel that these two sword pillars are extremely powerful and not easy to break. Let's look at the edge in the distance. They even knew that we wanted to escape from the sword array, so they might have built the edge of the sword array to be extremely strong. On the other hand, the central sword pillar, the sword chi is scattered around. It might be the weakest part of the sword array." "That makes sense." Heng nodded slightly. However, the yin-yang sword light was born from within the sword pillar and scattered from the center to the edges. These two sword pillars might not necessarily be the weakest points. They might even be the strongest points. At this moment, a magic treasure in the shape of a full moon was protecting a person. That person then summoned an azure primordial water to protect more than 10 people. They flew to the left of Heng Zhao and the others. The female cultivator who summoned the full moon magic treasure shouted, "Senior Martial Brother Xiang Ming, I Mingyu have something urgent to report." When Heng Zhao and the others saw the dozen or so people from the Huanhua sect easily escape the attack of the green and red sword light, their eyes were filled with surprise. However, when their gazes landed on the true water, they immediately looked away, afraid that they would fall into the illusion of the true water. Xiang Ming frowned slightly and said loudly, "Mingyue, what's the matter?" At this moment, Mingyu kept her magic treasure, while Fairy Hong Xia used the true water to shield the crowd. Ji Mingxiu and the other disciples of the Huanhua sect appeared in the true water. Mingyu bowed and said, "I'm Kai Hongxia, a Foundation Establishment disciple of the Huanhua sect. I'm here to report that something is wrong with the sword formation." "What's wrong?" "Quickly report it." Xiang Ming also had an impression of Fairy Hong Xia. However, the situation was urgent. When he saw Fairy Hong Xia using the true water to protect the Huanhua sect disciples, his expression softened and he urged. Fairy Hong Xia did not dare to delay and hurriedly explained her thoughts. She then added, "I feel that although the yin-yang sword pillar is strong, it must have been created by the sword that set up the formation. However, it is still the eye of the formation and is the key to activating the sword chi of the swordsman. It is definitely not as strong as the surrounding sword chi. On the other hand, the surrounding sword chi must have been activated by Xiujie and the other illusory swordsmen to prevent us from breaking out. It must be extremely powerful. Instead of breaking the formation at the edge, why don't we just face the swordsman and directly destroy the sword pillar in the eye of the formation?" "Good." Without waiting for Xiang Ming to speak, Heng Ming clapped his hands and said, "The Huanhua sect disciple is right. Just now, I's disciple, Li Zongbao, reminded I to break the strongest sword pillar in the sword formation. He did not take the disciples who set up the formation into consideration. What this disciple said is exactly what Li Zongbao said." Hearing this, Xiang Ming's face showed some displeasure. It was obvious that Heng Ming was trying to steal his credit. However, the people around him looked thoughtful. Xiang Ming thought about it and knew that what Heng Ming said was probably true. Li Zongbao might really have the ability to break the formation. Fellow Taoist Heng Ming, what you said is also the suggestion of my Huanhua sect disciple? Xiang Ming asked. That's right. Heng Ming nodded and looked at the crowd. He said, I was just thinking about how to break this formation. Since the Huanhua sect disciple has made this suggestion, then, we will split into two groups. One group will still be led by I to the edge of the sword formation and the other group will be led by Xiang Ming to the center of the formation. My disciple, Zongbao, will assist the Golden Core Taoists to break the yin-yang sword pillar. The Huanhua sect disciples will follow me to the edge of the formation. As for who will go to the center of the formation, Xiang Ming will have to choose for himself. Hearing this, Xiang Ming looked at Heng Ming helplessly. Actually, everyone knew that although what Fairy Hong Xia and Li Zongbao said was reasonable, the two sword pillars had to be broken at the center of the formation. They had just come out from there and now they had to turn back. If these two people's predictions were right, then so be it. If they were wrong, then they would be walking back into the tiger's den. Whoever Xiang Ming chose would most likely bring that person back to his death. Xiang Ming would not cause trouble for himself. He quickly said with a smile, Heng Ming, you must be joking. You are the one in control of this battle. How can I speak? Although I have to turn back to break the formation because of my disciple's suggestion, I can only choose the person to follow me. Hearing this, Fairy Hong Xia suddenly realized that her words had dragged Xiang Ming into a possible quagmire. She immediately bowed and said, Uncle Xiang, since I have made such a suggestion, then I must take responsibility. I am willing to accompany you to the center of the sword formation. Very good. Xiang Ming nodded slightly. His expression was unreadable. Mingyu also sighed. She did not think too much about it. Seeing Fairy Hong Xia's decisive choice, she did not say anything else. She flew to Fairy Hong Xia's side and expressed her support for Xiang Ming. Ji Mingxiu and the other Huanhua sect disciples were all clever people. Knowing that there was no need to hesitate, they immediately moved to Fairy Hong Xia's side. All of you follow Heng Ming to the edge of the formation. Seeing that his disciples had made such a decision, Xiang Ming was happy. He pointed at the disciples other than Mingyu and Fairy Hong Xia. Your cultivation is shallow. Even if you go back, you won't be able to help much. Your thoughts? I know. Yes. Ji Mingxiu and the rest did not dare to refute. They flew to Heng Ming's side. Li Zongbao pondered for a moment. Looking at Fairy Hong Xia and Mingyu, he also raised his immortal whip and flew to their left. Ah, this old man will volunteer. De Sun laughed and waved his hand. A few Tai Ching sect disciples followed him and flew to Li Zongbao's left. He said, Fellow Taoist Heng Ming, please don't blame me. That's right. I will also head to the center of the formation. Ji Hong's mind was also racing. Without waiting for Heng Ming to point her out, she flew to De Sun's side. Since you want to break the formation and find the weakness of the yin-yang sword formation, how can I be left out? Xiong Huasong was also confident and flew out with a smile. Following which, a few people flew out without waiting for Heng Ming to point out their names. They were Xuanyan sect's Gao Wei and the rest. Great. Heng Ming saw that the number of Golden Core cultivators who took the initiative to return was not more than half, but it was almost the same. He clapped his hands and laughed. Everyone is noble and unsullied. I appreciate it. When we break the yin-yang sword formation, it will be time for us to reward you. Fellow Taoists, please. With that, Heng Ming flew out first, leading the rest of the cultivators to the edge of the yin-yang sword formation. Xiang Ming led De Sun and the rest to the center of the formation. After flying for a while, Li Zongbao heard Fairy Hong Xia's voice transmission. Senior Brother Li, may I ask where did Xiaohua go? Xiaohua's whereabouts? I don't know either. Li Zongbao knew what Fairy Hong Xia was thinking. He frowned slightly and said, but I know that he is not in this sword tomb, nor is he in this sword formation. Sigh, Fairy Hong Xia sighed and did not ask any more questions. Junior sister. Hong Xia. Li Zongbao hesitated for a moment before he sent a voice transmission. If junior brother Xiao is here, even though his cultivation is outstanding, when it comes to truly fighting he might not be able to accomplish anything. Moreover, this is a sword formation against a magic formation. The effect of a single cultivator is much smaller. It is better that he is not here. Fairy Hong Xia clearly didn't understand the meaning behind Li Zhongbao's junior sister Hong Xia, nor did she understand the reason why Xiaohua wasn't here. She just casually responded. Li Zhongbao also didn't know Fairy Hong Xia's understanding of Xiaohua, so he didn't say anything more. The green and red sword pillars shot straight up into the sky, then connected with the green and red sword light dozens of miles away, forming the entire yin-yang sword formation. On the sword pillars, Xiu Jie of the Kuan sword sect, Yang Jioding of the Supreme Harmony sword sect, Meng Changshu of the Soaring Feather sect and Li Ying of the Herd of Maka's Valley looked coldly at the bloody massacre in the sword formation, with a hint of excitement in their eyes. Xiu Jie looked at the corpses of the Qi Refinement and Foundation Establishment initial stage disciples within a few miles of the sword pillars. He turned to Yang Jioding and said, "Fellow Taoist Yang, it is indeed as senior sister Lu said. The cultivators of the Tao sect were already terrified and fled in panic. No one noticed the two yin-yang sword pillars." Chapter 2667. Yes, senior sister Lu is the mastermind. Everything is going according to her plan. Yang Jioding also nodded. Although there were some deviations when we entered the sword tomb, the flaws do not obscure the beauty. The final outcome is still in her hands. Li Ying frowned slightly and said, "It's a pity that these Tao sect cultivators did not scatter and flee as LV Jianyu expected. I'm afraid that our yin-yang sword formation will not be able to withstand a full-force attack from those Tao sect golden core cultivators." He, Yang Jioding chuckled and said, "You don't have to worry about that, Li Jianyu. Although the situation of the cultivators retreating is beyond senior sister Lu's expectations, she has already made arrangements for such a situation. The sword formation that junior sister Xiujie and I have laid down will fight them to the death in the end. All of the sword chi of the yin-yang sword formation will be gathered in one place when it is time to fight. The Tao sect cultivators that have been killed by the yin-yang sword formation will not be able to withstand a single blow from the yin-yang sword formation." "I hope so." Li Ying did not seem to think that the situation was as optimistic as Yang Jioding's. He only nodded slightly. Just as he nodded, his yellow eyes flashed slightly as he noticed the abnormality of the yin-yang sword formation. He hurriedly pointed his finger and said, "Not good. The Tao sect cultivators have discovered the secret of the yin-yang sword formation. More than 10 golden core cultivators are leading their disciples over." "Oh, it's true." The smile on Yang Jioding's face froze. With the help of the sword formation, he could see clearly and cried out involuntarily. Meng Changshu said leisurely, "There are indeed many hidden dragons and crouching tigers among the Tao sect cultivators. They still managed to discover it in such a short time." "So what?" Yang Jioding refused to admit defeat. "The yin-yang sword pillar is activated by the yin-yang sword. Even golden core cultivators will find it difficult to resist. Even if they discover it and come here, they can only temporarily affect the sword formation. When we kill them." "Senior brother Yang," Xiujie reminded him. "Let's make preparations. Every moment counts. The yin-yang sword formation has already killed tens of thousands of Qi Refinement and Foundation Establishment cultivators. We have already completed senior sister Lu's task." "Yes." When Yang Jioding heard this, his heart skipped a beat. He immediately activated the sword essence in his body as his body emitted a scarlet sword beam. A flying sword that resembled a blazing sun flew out from his body. However, as soon as the flying sword fell into the scarlet sword pillar, all of its sword intent disappeared, and it returned to being a flying sword that floated within the scarlet sword light. It was unknown whether it was Yang Jioding's sword intent or the yin-yang sword light that forced Yang Jioding's sword intent to revert back to a flying sword. Xiang Ming led the numerous golden core cultivators past the group of cultivators fighting against the sword formation and returned to the left side of the dragon-slaying slope. In the time it took for Xiang Ming and the rest to return, over 10,000 Tao sect disciples were killed by the green and red sword light. Seeing that there was no one around the left side of the dragon-slaying slope, Xiang Ming understood what Fairy Hong Xia meant. The slight anger he had towards Ming Yu and Fairy Hong Xia had already dissipated. "Ming Yu." Xiang Ming pondered for a moment before instructing, "You and Kai Hongxia will lead a few Foundation Establishment disciples to the sword pillar and find out what's going on." "Yes." Just as Ming Yu agreed, 2 green and red sword lights emitted a rumbling sound. Bus. Yang Jioding and Xiujie's figures appeared near the sword pillar. Xiujie's smile was like a flower as she said, "So it's fellow Taoist Xiang Ming from the Washing Flower sect. Welcome back." Since when did a sword cultivator become a fellow Taoist of my Tao sect?" Xiang Ming sneered, but Xiao Jie continued to smile. Look at what fellow Taoist Xiang Ming is saying. I thought that fellow Taoist missed me and specially came back to visit me. Bah. Xiang Ming spat out a mouthful of saliva and sneered, although I am not talented, how can I look down on an outsider? If you surrender to my Tao sect, this old man can still consider it. Xiao Jie was not someone who would compromise. She was only pretending to stall for time. How could she know that Xiang Ming's words were so unpleasant to hear? Naturally, she knew that she could not reply and could not say another word. Thus she kept her mouth shut. Hehe, fellow Taoist Xiao Jie. Xiang Ming's interest was piqued as he laughed. This old man does not mind your looks. If you have the heart, shut up. Xiao Jie sneered. The azure sword light around her flickered rapidly. She made a sword sign and the small sword floating in front of her suddenly jumped out of the azure sword light like a fish and stabbed towards Xiang Ming. At the same time, a red brilliance also separated from the scarlet sword pillar where Yang Jioding was and flew out of the sword pillar at almost the same time as Xiao Ming's small sword. The two small swords were like two birds who were willing to fly together. The moment they flew out of the sword pillar, they immediately snuggled together like two young men and women who were intimately attached to each other and flew towards Xiang Ming together. Xiang Ming sneered. He stretched out his hand and a spiritual talisman appeared in his hand. He said anxiously, fellow Taoists, the situation is urgent. We must not give the sword cultivator any chance to breathe. The spiritual talisman in Xiang Ming's hand suddenly expanded. With the activation of Xiang Ming's spiritual power, a palm of several feet in size flashed in the air. It was Xiang Ming's protective spiritual talisman, the Hand of the Nascent Soul. The Hand of the Nascent Soul had already appeared and the surrounding area was shrouded by the power of the Hand of the Nascent Soul. Although the azure and red flying swords were unusually agile, under this extremely heavy imprisonment, they still could not move an inch as if they had fallen into a quagmire. Seeing this situation, Xiang Ming was overjoyed and said with a smile, this old man does not mind your looks as a sword cultivator. If you have the heart. Unfortunately, before Xiang Ming finished speaking, the azure sword light around Xiao Jie's body shone brightly. At the same time, a sword light separated from the sword pillar behind her and rushed towards the azure small sword. Almost at the same time as Xiao Jie, Yang Jioding also pointed his finger. A sword light of several feet in size separated from the sword pillar and rushed towards the small scarlet sword. A loud sword cry rang out as the two swords suddenly expanded and shot towards the huge nascent soul hand to entangle it. Quick! Xiang Ming was slightly shocked, but he did not stop making hand seals. The huge hand slightly clenched and grabbed the two enlarged flying swords. There was a crisp sound like bamboo being broken. Yang Jioding and Xiao Jie's faces turned pale. A cold snort came from above everyone's head. Meng Changshuo's body shone with azure and red brilliance. As the brilliance shone, an exquisite lantern appeared in the air. The exquisite lantern was right in between the crimson red and azure sword light. As the exquisite lantern emitted its brilliance, the sword light of the two sword pillars actually stopped, breaking off from the green and red sword light that was dozens of feet away, and converging on the exquisite lantern. Swoosh, like a peacock spreading its tail, the azure and red sword lights were like 7 rotating colors. They were extremely fast and powerful as they pierced towards the Tao sect cultivators. Not good. Not only was Xiang Ming shocked, but Ji Hong and the rest were also shocked. The sword lights piercing towards them were obviously very powerful. They were comparable to the full-strength attack of an illusory swordsman. If they did not use their full strength to counter it, they would definitely be hit by the azure and red sword lights. Rumble. There was a series of sounds. In the face of Ji Hong's defense, Li Zongbao's immortal piercing whip and Fairy Hong Xia's Xiantian primordial water, the azure and red sword lights did not weaken at all. Instead they gained the upper hand. The azure and red sword lights even passed through Xiang Ming's nascent soul hand and merged with Yang Jioding and Xiao Jie's sword lights. They almost broke Xiang Ming's nascent soul hand. However, the green-red sword light was only able to break through the defenses of the other cultivators. It was unable to harm them. Seeing that Xiang Ming's talisman was effective, De Sun raised his eyebrows. He turned to look at the others and shouted, fellow cultivators, success or failure depends on this. Yes. Xiong Huasong, Ji Hong and the rest responded in unison. With a wave of their hands, numerous spirit talismans appeared in their hands. The dermic powers in their bodies were activated slightly. Immediately, brilliance of various colors emerged from the spirit talismans. Several powerful suction forces were also emitted at the same time. Waves of heaven and earth spiritual energy uncontrollably formed into hurricanes and frantically poured into the spirit talismans. One by one, large swaying hands slowly appeared in midair. Although the Yuanying hands had yet to be activated, the space within 100 feet of them had already solidified. An incomparably powerful aura suppressed Li Zongbao, Fairy Hongxia and the rest. Under this aura, the sword pillar that was like a heavenly jade pillar let out a loud roar. It sounded like a sorrowful cry but also like a cry of struggle. At the same time, the red sword light and blue sword light inside the sword pillar trembled rapidly. Waves of sword energy shot out from the sword light and rushed around the nascent soul's hand as if it was trying to resist the restriction. Yang Jioding and Xiu Jia were as calm as water. It was as if they already knew that this would happen. However, their eyes were filled with a strong desire to fight. Yang Jioding raised his head slightly and looked at Xiu Jia, who was in front of the azure sword lights. Xiu Jia met Yang Jioding's gaze and nodded slightly. As if they had a tacit understanding, the sword lights around the two of them became even more resplendent. The sword lights even covered the two of them. Then, a powerful suction force was released from their bodies. Woo woo, two soft sounds were heard. The two small swords that were caught by Xiang Ming's nascent soul hand suddenly let out a sword cry. They struggled with all their might and fell into the suction force. "Io!" Xiang Ming was slightly stunned. The powerful suction force from the sword pillar had actually sucked the two flying swords away. That was not all. Just as the two flying swords rushed out of the nascent soul hand and approached the sword pillar, Yang Jioding and Xiu Jia's transformed flying swords also slowly rushed out of the sword pillar. The huge flying swords, one green and one red, had a sword light trailing behind them. This sword light was also connected to the sword pillar. In the blink of an eye, the two flying swords entered the giant sword pillar. The two flying swords let out a loud roar and a powerful suction force came from the giant swords, shattering the suction force from the nascent soul hand. At the same time, there was an absolute sharpness within the suction force. As the two flying swords vibrated and flew, an unstoppable force formed at the tips of the two flying swords. This sharp force accelerated as the flying swords shot towards Xiang Ming's nascent soul hand. Chapter 2668. You're courting death, Xiang Ming sneered. His whole body flashed with the same brilliance. The Dharma power in the Jindan rushed into the hand of the Yuanying. The hand of the Yuanying shook again and even flashed with layers of shadows. The big hand grabbed the two second-grade illusory swords. Rumble, a series of deafening explosions rang out incessantly. The light was dazzling and the sound was ear-piercing. Li Zongbao and Fairy Hongxia aside, even De Sun, Xiong Huasong, and the others felt a sharp pain in their divine senses. It was as if they had been injured by the green and red sword radiance. Not good. Xiang Ming suddenly exclaimed. With a loud boom, a foot-long gap was blasted open on the thumb of the nascent soul's hand by Yang Jioding and Xiu Jia's flying swords. As soon as the gap appeared, it immediately expanded uncontrollably. The entire nascent soul's hand showed signs of collapsing. How could Xiang Ming dare to be negligent? He tried his best to activate his true yuan. The nascent soul's hand flashed with brilliance, trying to repair the gap. Woo, the two flying swords swayed slightly as if they were preparing to attack. Then they rushed towards Xiang Ming again. How dare you? At this time, De Sun's nascent soul's hand had already formed. He snorted coldly and also grabbed at the two flying swords. Unexpectedly, just as De Sun's nascent soul's hand reached out, the two flying swords suddenly turned around and rushed towards Ji Hong, who was the furthest away from Xiang Ming. Oh no! Ji Hong's nascent soul's hand had already been severely injured in the fight with LV Ruochang. At this time, it had just been summoned. The speed of absorbing the spiritual energy of heaven and earth was not as fast as De Sun and Xiang Ming's, so it had not formed at all. Seeing the two flying swords turn towards her, she immediately had a bad feeling. While Ji Hong tried to activate her nascent soul's hand to block the flying swords, she also hurriedly patted her forehead, preparing to summon her magical weapon. Boom! At this time, the two flying swords suddenly sped up, far faster than before. Before Ji Hong could summon her magical weapon, the two flying swords had already pierced her nascent soul's hand. The two green and red sword radiances twisted together, and the nascent soul's hand was like a broken lantern, splashing brilliance in all directions. It was cut in half by the two sword radiances. That was not all. The sword light did not stop as the nascent soul's hand rumbled and swept towards Ji Hong's body. Ji Hong was almost scared out of her wits. She was only at the early stage of Jindan realm and could barely activate the Hand of Yuanying. Previously, when she was fighting with LV Ruochang, her Jindan had already been damaged. Now she was facing the Yin and Yang sword light of two second-grade illusory swordsmen. Within the sword light, the Yin and Yang shackled the spiritual power in her body, and the sharper sword chi cut her vitality into pieces. Instantly Ji Hong's mind went blank. Even the magic treasure that she had yet to use remained in her body. Fellow Taoist Zhou Qingping from the Thousand Leaf Ridge shouted anxiously from not far away. Perhaps, this is what Taoist Chen Mo is thinking. Ji Hong knew why she had to follow Xiang Ming to the center of the Yin-Yang sword formation. It was because her desire to kill LV Ruochang was too strong that she encouraged Heng Zhao to mobilize hundreds of thousands of Dao sect disciples to chase after the sword cultivator. If not for this old woman's stubbornness, right now our Dao sect would definitely be celebrating. Ji Hong's return this time was originally because she had some thoughts. If she could not break this Yin-Yang sword formation, how could she face the elders of the Clear Leaf sect? However, she never expected that before she could even use one or two of her methods, the sword cultivator's Yin-Yang sword light would choose her first. And she did not even have the slightest strength to fight back. Forget it. Ji Hong's thoughts changed. She gritted her teeth and wanted to self-destruct to injure Yang Jioding and Xiujia. Unfortunately, she was still too optimistic. Just as she had this thought, the green and red sword light crossed in front of her and pierced through her body. Not even a drop of blood appeared. When the sword light flew away, the spiritual energy of heaven and earth swept past. With a ping sound, blood splattered everywhere. Ji Hong was actually split into two by the Yin-Yang sword light. Bitch, where do you think you're going? Thousand Leaf Ridge's Zhou Qingping had a good relationship with Ji Hong. Just now he reminded Ji Hong. At this time, he shouted and urged his nascent soul hand to chase after the two flying swords. I will help you too. Qin Fan Valley Su Zhiqi shouted and also chased after the two flying swords with a faint blue shadow hand. Seeing Ji Hong die, Xiang Ming was naturally shocked. At the same time, he also urged his nascent soul hand to block the two flying swords. It was as if the two flying swords had no way to escape under the imprisonment of these nascent soul hands. However, it was at this moment that the two flying swords suddenly shattered, transforming into two streaks of light that were even faster than lightning. Furthermore, the place where they were fleeing was not high up in the sky where the nascent soul cultivators had surrounded them. Instead, they rushed into the ground of dragon-slaying slope. What kind of sword cultivation secret technique is this? Xiong Huasong and the others were slightly surprised. Xiong Huasong and Desun's nascent soul hands had already formed. These two big hands did not block the two flying swords. Instead, they grabbed at the green and red sword pillars from the left and right. The sword chi on the sword pillars tried its best to resist, but the power of the nascent soul hands was too strong. The sword pillars began to shake gradually in the hands of the nascent soul. When Xiang Ming and the others saw Yang Jioding and Xiujia escape into the ground, they immediately split into two groups. Xiang Ming's big hands grabbed at the green sword pillars, while Zhou Qingping and Su Zhiqi's big hands slapped the ground. However, before the two of them slapped the dragon-slaying slope with their nascent soul hands, they heard a loud moo-moo sound coming from the ground of dragon-slaying slope. It was as if tens of thousands of bulls were crying out in unison. Boom! Just as this loud sound was produced, the two sword pillars began to tremble rapidly again. However, this time they did not expand but gradually contracted. In the blink of an eye, two huge swords condensed into the shape of swords and rushed out from the green and red sword pillars. Come! Xiang Ming shouted. His big hands suddenly grabbed the sword pillars that had shrunk to the size of a bowl. Wang, a loud sword cry came out from the sword pillars. Just as Xiang Ming and Xiong Huasong grabbed the red sword pillars, Yang Jioding's sword light rushed out from the hands of the two nascent souls. Naturally, Xiujia's sword light also rushed out from the hands of Desun's nascent soul. This doesn't seem to be just the strength of a second-grade illusory swordsman. The three of them were a little shocked. However, before they could recover from their shock, they noticed the abnormality in the sky. They saw that the exquisite lamp that Meng Changshu had transformed into had expanded several times under the green and red brilliance. The flying swords that Yang Jioding and Xiujia had transformed into actually rushed out from the sword pillars and flew towards the exquisite lamp. Moreover, the two sword pillars also followed the two sword lights towards the exquisite lamp. Boom! With a loud sound as if an oil lamp had been lit, the two sword pillars rushed into the exquisite lamp. The entire exquisite lamp emitted a dazzling green and red brilliance. It illuminated the area within a radius of several li. Not good. Seeing such a change, Sun and the others were surprised and happy. They were happy because the two sword pillars that rushed into the exquisite lamp had lost contact with the green and red sword light in the sky. They had cut off the connection between the yin-yang sword formation's eye and the surroundings. Heng Zhao and the others could easily use their nascent soul hands to break through the formation's edge. But they were shocked because Yang Jioding, Xiujia and Meng Changshu had done this. They definitely had a powerful backup plan. They would definitely have to use all their strength to deal with it. Perhaps, just as the thought appeared in their minds, the exquisite lamp that Meng Changshu had transformed into began to spin again. Dozens of green and red brilliance flew out from the exquisite lamp at the same time, piercing towards Sun and the others. Tisk tisk, the sword lights swept past and the sound of them breaking through the air was extremely ear-piercing. Caw! A phoenix cry rang out. Fairy Hong Xia did not dare to hesitate any longer. Her ice phoenix spell body flew out of her body, and the Xiantian primordial water poured out layer after layer, surrounding the space around her. There were dozens of layers of Xiantian primordial water, if not hundreds of layers. Fairy Hong Xia had discovered that the Xiantian primordial water's defense against the yin-yang sword light was limited, which was why she had racked her brains to come up with a countermeasure. Mingyu, Li Zongbao and the other Golden Core and Foundation establishment cultivators who were close to Fairy Hong Xia did not hesitate as they quickly dodged under the Xiantian primordial water. Boom! The three sword lights hit the Xiantian primordial water. The sword lights shook rapidly within the primordial water, and the dozens of layers of Xiantian primordial water were about to break through. Ka! The ice phoenix spell body let out a mournful cry. Another sword light hit the left wing of the spell body, and a corner of the left wing was sliced off. Fairy Hong Xia also let out a loud cry as her body trembled rapidly. She could no longer control her spell body and it shrank back into her body. Mingyu and Li Zongbao did not dare to delay as they quickly flew to the left side of Fairy Hong Xia, and took out their magic treasures to protect her. At the same time, the Xiantian primordial water that had blocked the three sword lights was naturally kept back into the ice phoenix spell body. However, after being protected by so many layers of Xiantian primordial water, the sword lights were much slower, and their power was also much weaker. There was no need for Fairy Hong Xia to defend herself. Mingyu, Li Zongbao and the rest who were protecting her worked together to destroy the three sword lights. However, the sword lights were much more powerful than before. The cracks on Mingyu's magic treasure were even larger, and Li Zongbao's immortal piercing whip was almost sent flying by the sword lights. With Fairy Hong Xia's Xiantian primordial water, Mingyu, Li Zongbao and the rest were lucky. They knew that the yin-yang sword lights that had penetrated dozens of layers of Xiantian primordial water were still so powerful. What about those cultivators who did not have Xiantian primordial water protecting them? At the same time that the sword lights hit Fairy Hong Xia's ice phoenix spell body, the other yin-yang sword lights attacked Sun, Xiang Ming and the rest under the control of the exquisite lamp. Almost at the same time, the yin-yang sword lights hit the talisman in the Yuanying's hand. Like a paper doll being cut by a pair of scissors, an extremely obvious crack appeared on the talisman. Sun and the rest were already prepared. The magic power in their bodies surged rapidly, and the light on their hands flashed violently. They clenched their fists tightly, trying their best to control the sharpness of the sword lights. Boom! After holding on for only a moment, Zhou Qingping and Su Zhiqi's hands collapsed, and the light was extinguished. After a loud boom, the green-red sword lights, like before, casually intersected with the two's bodies. As their protective golden light was extinguished, the two did not even have the chance to scream. They were dead. Chapter 2669. Two golden core cultivators with protective talismans could not escape from the yin-yang sword radiance, much less those without talismans who could not hide under the connate primordial water. Under the two sword radiances, the two golden core cultivators were sliced in half, their corpses falling from the sky. Fortunately, the exquisite lamp could not control much of the yin-yang sword radiance. The remaining golden core and foundation establishment cultivators who were not attacked by the yin-yang sword radiance fled in all directions. Just as everyone was escaping, the yin-yang sword radiance in Xiang Ming, Sun and Xiong Huasong's hands let out a wail and gradually collapsed. Let's do it together. Seeing this, Sun didn't care about the three-sword cultivators who were gradually revealing themselves as the light of the exquisite lamp faded. He shouted loudly and the three of them grabbed the two sword pillars with their talismans at the same time. It was as if three huge hands were really grabbing the two long flying swords. The green and red sword pillars, which were only as thick as a bowl, shook left and right in the hands of the three huge hands and actually showed signs of collapsing. The exquisite lamp's radiance was cold and lonely. Meng Changshuo's figure appeared. His face was pale and his body was trembling slightly. It was completely out of his control. On his left and right, Xiao Jie and Yang Jioding's faces were emitting a dark red radiance and the other a dark green radiance. They did not look normal. The situation doesn't look good. Li Ying did not make a move. He flew to the left of Meng Changshuo to protect him and said softly, "I'm afraid my yin-yang sword formation can't." Just as Li Ying finished speaking, a faint loud sound came from afar. The four of them looked up and saw that the green and red sword radiance had disappeared. Heng Zhao and company must have defeated the enemy at the edge of the yin-yang sword formation. Forget it. Yang Jioding sighed and said, "The talismans of the Dao sect cultivators are too powerful. They are comparable to a nascent soul cultivator's attack. We already expected this before we set up the formation. The three of you have already contributed a lot to the sword domain." Li Ying nodded and said, "This formation has killed tens of thousands of cultivators. We should be proud. Let's go." Meng Changshuo looked at the sword pillar that had been shaken by Sun and the others and said, "The yin-yang sword has been controlled by a nascent soul. It won't be long before the eye of the yin-yang sword array is broken." "How can it be that easy?" Xiao Jie sneered. He opened his mouth and his intrinsic sword rushed out. "Sword friend Xiao Jie." Yang Jioding was shocked. "If you lose this sword, I'm afraid your cultivation will fall to the first grade of the illusory sword realm." "So what if I'm a first-grade illusory sword?" Xiao Jie said coldly, "Even if I fall into the drawing sword realm, I'm still willing." "All right." Yang Jioding clapped his hands and opened his mouth. A small crimson sword flew out and followed Xiao Jie's azure sword into the green and red sword pillar. What was different from before was that Xiao Jie's small azure sword had fallen into the scarlet sword pillar, while Yang Jioding's small scarlet sword had fallen into the azure sword pillar. Rumble, the moment the two small swords entered the sword pillar, there was an explosion. Xiao Jie and Yang Jioding's bodies went limp and they almost collapsed in midair. Meng Changshuo and Li Ying did not dare to delay. They reached out to support the two of them and ignored the crowd of cultivators as they rushed into the sky. The sword pillar exploded from where the two small swords entered and began to collapse. Even the nascent soul hands of Sun and the others were unable to stop or restrain it. As the sword pillar fell, the green and red sword beams around the yin-yang sword array also began to collapse and fell along with the sword pillar. "Oh no, dodge." Seeing this, Xiang Ming immediately shouted. He extended his nascent soul hands and covered an area of 100 feet. Sun, Xiong Huasong and the rest also understood. Several nascent soul hands flew out and covered an area of 100 feet, protecting Fairy Hong Xia and the rest. Even the fleeing Golden Core and Foundation Establishment cultivators hurriedly flew back. In the blink of an eye, the sword pillar completely collapsed and fell into the Dragon Punishing Slope. Following this, the entire Dragon Punishing Slope shook violently, even more than when the sword beams appeared. Seeing tens of thousands of cyan and red sword lights flying out of the ground, those cyan and red flying swords flying out of the yin-yang sword formation also flew out and slapped towards the entire yin-yang sword formation within a radius of tens of miles like a tidal wave. Ah! Screams of agony rang out incessantly, almost like a purge. Cultivators below the middle stage of Foundation Establishment were unable to withstand the final wave of yin-yang sword chi alone. Another several thousand cultivators fell. After the miserable shriek sounded, the terrifying green-red sword light that was dozens of miles away had completely disappeared. I'm afraid the yin-yang sword array has been broken by our combined efforts? Xiang Ming, Sun and the rest retracted their nascent soul hands. Under their protection, the dozens of cultivators following them did not suffer any losses. Even if it's broken, we've also suffered heavy losses. Xiong Huasong's face was gloomy. He knew in his heart that the low-level cultivators who could survive in the yin-yang sword array were few and far between. The sword cultivator had set up this yin-yang sword array with the intention of killing all the cultivators. Quickly meet up with fellow Taoist Heng Ming and the rest. Xiang Ming instructed a few disciples to collect the corpses of Ji Hong and the rest. With a wave of his hand, he led the group towards the edge of the yin-yang sword array. Although it was only a short few miles, the tragic scene along the way was really unbearable to look at. Not only was the smell of blood in their mouths and noses, but the bloodstains on the ground and the dismembered limbs made one feel as if this was not the human world. In the many years of the Great Tao battle, none of the great arrays were as tragic as this one. Sai, Fairy Hong Xia's Dharma body was injured by the yin-yang sword beams, and her own body was also injured. Her body flew slightly slower and was almost at the back. Seeing this scene, she could not help but sigh. Our Tao sect cultivators have suffered too many casualties, but that hateful sword cultivator did not even leave behind a corpse. Mingyu and Li Zongbao did not fly too far away and stood guard beside her. Mingyu did not understand Li Zongbao's eagerness. Previously, she had not seen Li Zongbao and Fairy Hong Xia's relationship. However, when she thought of Li Zongbao's reputation in the three kingdoms of cultivation and Fairy Hong Xia's beauty, she naturally understood. She smiled and replied, "The sword cultivators are all hiding behind the sword array. Even if they were killed by us, their corpses would not be exposed in the sword array. Furthermore, the sword array does not only depend on one's strength, it also depends on one's luck. Everything else aside, if not for Martial Niece Hong Xia's Xiantian primordial water, Martial Niece Zongbao and I would have died too." Fairy Hong Xia's expression darkened as she said softly, "I naturally understand what Martial Aunt Mingyu is saying. Although I am a little disgusted by this battle, seeing the corpses everywhere, I can't help but hate the sword cultivators. I can't wait to kill them all. I can't wait to see the corpses of sword cultivators everywhere. Only then can I quench the hatred in my heart." Li Zongbao's expression was still indifferent as he looked straight ahead. He did not participate in the conversation between the two. Mingyu looked at Li Zongbao and said softly, "Martial Niece Zongbao, you are famous in this battle and have killed countless sword cultivators. Do you have such thoughts?" "All right, Martial Aunt understands." Li Zongbao replied indifferently, "Under the great Tao, all are ants. In the great battle, all are vengeful spirits. If I don't kill the sword cultivators will kill me. There's no other way." "Thank you, Senior Li." Fairy Hong Xia understood Li Zongbao's words and said softly. Mingyu felt that this was a good opportunity and wanted Li Zongbao to talk more with Fairy Hong Xia. However, Fairy Hong Xia did not say anything else after a "thank you." Li Zongbao's expression was even colder. Mingyu could not help but sigh. However, before she could think about it, Mingyu frowned and said, "The sword array is filled with the corpses of our Tao sect cultivators. Why don't the surviving disciples collect the corpses? Now that the sword array has been destroyed, even if there were hundreds of thousands of sword cultivators, they would not dare to face hundreds of thousands of cultivators directly, right?" "Martial Aunt Mingyu." Li Zongbao glanced at the expression on Mingyu's face and explained, "According to my master, this array has more than one layer. If we collect the corpses now, there will be enough space for the sword cultivators to set up the array. We might as well do it in one go." "What? There's still a sword array?" Mingyu did not think as far as Hung Heng and the rest. She could not help but cry out. Li Zongbao laughed bitterly in his heart, but there was no change in his expression as he replied, "Everything is just a guess. Now, it's time to uncover the mystery." Mingyu looked ahead doubtfully. They had returned from the dragon-slaying slope. Although their flying speed was not slow, it could not be compared to the disciples who had been advancing towards the west side of the sword array. After the yin-yang sword array was destroyed, they had rushed out of the yin-yang sword array like a tidal wave and had long disappeared. The yin-yang sword array is already so powerful. Sword cultivators, what other tricks do they have? Fairy Hong Xia's face showed a trace of fear. If it was anyone else, even if it was Mingyu, Li Zongbao might not answer this question. But Fairy Hong Xia was Kai Zhuoxia's sister and Xiao Hua's lover. Li Zongbao had to answer. Black Sky Sect's martial uncle Xiong Huasong was able to set up the 10-direction annihilation array. The magic within is far beyond my imagination. I believe that sword cultivator LV Ruochang might not lose to martial uncle Xiong? For a moment, everyone was silent. LV Ruochang had led tens of thousands of swordsmen to destroy the golden annihilation array. This had long changed everyone's impression of sword cultivators as barbaric. The yin-yang sword array just now would no longer be looked down upon. Just at this moment, the rumbling sound rose again. It was still coming from all directions, and it was pushing towards the direction of dragon-slaying slope. As expected, no one spoke, but this sentence rang in everyone's heart at the same time. Furthermore, everyone's face changed color. "Let's go quickly." Mingyu placed her hand on Fairy Hong Xia's shoulder and said, "Don't use your powers. I'll bring you along. Thank you, Martial Uncle. Fairy Hong Xia expressed her gratitude. The three of them increased their speed and flew towards the west side. Run. The three of them flew for a moment and met a large group of cultivators who were fleeing in panic. Everyone was panicking and had long lost their formation when they were fleeing. There were even a few cultivators who were shouting loudly. Chapter 2670. Shut up. Li Zongbao raised the immortal piercing whip in his hand and shouted, "We are all Dao sect cultivators. Even if we fall into the sword array of a sword cultivator, we must remain calm. How can you make such a big fuss?" Senior brother Li. Hearing Li Zongbao shout, everyone turned around. Seeing that it was Li Zongbao who had killed Qin Jian, they were all overjoyed. All of you don't panic. Just focus on defending the formation. Even if there is a sword array, there will be a golden core stage elder to break it. Li Zongbao said calmly, the yin-yang sword array was already so powerful and all of you managed to escape unscathed. Even if there is a sword array, what can it do to us? Now that all of you are in such a mess, even if the elders break the array, all of you will not be able to escape. That's right, senior brother Li is right. Some of the Foundation establishment stage elders heard and shouted, urging the scattered cultivators to get back into formation. In fact, everyone understood the logic behind Li Zongbao's words. These late Foundation establishment old men could also say it, but unfortunately, not many people would listen. Now that Li Zongbao was standing there like a white jade pillar supporting the heavens, his words were even more effective than the words of 100 late Foundation establishment old men. That steady aura slowly spread out, and the tremors in the distance were no longer as frightening as before. All of you advance in an orderly manner. If you encounter a sword cultivator's attack, you can use the array to attack. Do not try to be a hero and face the sword chi alone. Li Zongbao reminded again, I will follow the golden core stage elders to the edge of the array and see if we can find any loopholes. Thank you senior brother Li for breaking the array. All the cultivators, regardless of which sect they were from, shouted. All of you protect yourselves well. Li Zongbao nodded slightly and gave Mingyu a look. The two of them increased their speed again. Mingyu saw that Li Zongbao was commanding the troops well and calmly, and was able to stabilize the morale of the troops better than a golden core cultivator like herself. She could not help but feel happy for Fairy Hong Xia. However, in Mingyu's eyes, Fairy Hong Xia's performance was not as she had imagined. As Mingyu and the others flew, they encountered more and more disciples. Most of these disciples stopped respectfully in mid-air. However, there were still some disciples who glanced at the three of them without any expression on their faces. It was as if in this critical moment, they could only rely on themselves. What golden core? What masters? They were all useless. Mingyu and the rest did not mind. In the face of danger, everyone's life were their own lives. Even if a nascent soul cultivator could not protect a low-level disciple, why should they be so respectful? Xiang Ming and the others were indeed flying very fast. At this moment they had already reached the edge of the yin-yang sword formation. There were tens of thousands of cultivators directly facing the edge of the yin-yang sword formation. Their attacks covered an area of several hundred meters, and the intensity of their attacks was also extremely dense. Unfortunately, the yin-yang sword array was formed by hundreds of thousands of sword cultivators and yin-yang swords. LV Ruochang had already considered the methods that the Dao sect cultivators would use to break the array. The array formed by tens of thousands of cultivators was very simple. How could it break the sword array? Before Hung Ting arrived and Xiang Ming and the others destroyed the array core, the attacks of the tens of thousands of cultivators were like scratching an itch. They were completely useless. There were even a few times when the green and red swords rampaged about without restraint. Many mid- and late-stage Foundation establishment cultivators were unable to dodge in time and were slain by the swords. Although some of the late-stage Foundation establishment cultivators had been killed, the group of cultivators facing the sword light had no way of retreating. They could only brace themselves and step over the corpses of their fellow sect members to fight. As a result, the number of high-level Foundation establishment disciples who died here was actually much higher than the number inside the formation. Sigh. Xiang Ming sighed and glanced at De Sun and Xiong Huasong. Both of them looked terrible as well. De Sun waved the horsetail whisk in his hand and said in a low voice, "Fellow Taoist Heng Ming and the others are already far away. Let's hurry over. If nothing happens." De Sun had only just spoken when another rumbling sound came from a few kilometers away. This sound was like the beating of a drum, but it was also like a tsunami. Shortly after, the ground shook once more, and an indescribable clamor arose in everyone's hearts. Xiong Huasong narrowed his eyes and looked into the distance. He said coldly, "LV Ruochang. She is indeed my enemy. Besides the yin-yang sword array, there are other sword arrays. Let's go. I'd like to see how many disciples this sword cultivator has to be able to set up such a huge array." De Sun raised his eyebrows and said in high spirits. His previous depression had long disappeared. Xiang Ming also came to a realization. He turned to look at the golden core cultivators around him and the tens of thousands of Foundation establishment disciples flying around him. He laughed and said, "That's right. 10 times the amount. LV Ruochang actually set up 2 layers of sword arrays. How many disciples can she have? The second array? I'm afraid it's a bit of a bluff." Sure enough, when everyone listened carefully, although the vibrations and sounds seemed to be coming from all directions, if one were to carefully observe, they would be able to tell that most of the sounds were coming from the west. The sounds from the east, north and south were much smaller. In fact, the sounds were spreading in 3 directions. "Haha, little brat from the Tao sect, I've been waiting for you here for a long time." A thunderous voice came from the sky in the distance. At the same time, a figure like an iron tower loomed in the sky. It was unknown if this person's cultivation was high or if it was the effect of the sword array, but the impression that this person gave off was extremely tall and mighty. "Humph, ignorant sword cultivator." Not far from that person, a cold voice sounded. Then, a golden light flew out from the source of the voice. A slender rope about 10 feet long flew into the sky and rushed towards that person like a dragon. "This is fellow Taoist Lu Xinwu's spirit binding chains." Xiang Ming was very familiar with Lu Xinwu from the Shanghua sect. Once he saw the golden light from the magic treasure, he hurriedly said. While everyone was moving, they looked at the sky anxiously to see how that swordsman would deal with it. But they saw that the spirit binding chains seemed to have a mind of their own. They flew against the wind and in the blink of an eye, flew in front of that tall swordsman. "Ayaya," that swordsman cried out in surprise. His blurry figure was revealed. It was a burly man whose body was pitch black from head to toe like charcoal. Following the swordsman's cry of surprise, his body actually staggered, as if he had stepped on something slippery. He was unable to dodge in time and the spirit binding chains immediately wrapped around his body. Ha! Seeing this, a few young disciples in the initial stage of Foundation establishment could not help but laugh. One of them even said, "Such a clumsy swordsman." However, before this disciple could finish his sentence, he saw that the swordsman's body flashed with an intense black sword light. The sword light also destroyed the spirit binding chains in an instant. At the same time, the black sword light flashed and spun rapidly around the swordsman's body. Not good. Seeing this, Lu Xinwu knew that he had fallen into the swordsman's trap. At the same time, he knew that things were not going well and hurriedly formed a spell to retract the spirit binding chains. However, the swordsman's body seemed to have an indescribable suction force. No matter how Lu Xinwu channeled his magic power, the spirit binding chains could not break free from the black sword light's binding. Boom, a loud sound rang out. The black sword light around the swordsman's body suddenly expanded, like the black quills of a hedgehog. Lu Xinwu immediately lost his connection with the spirit binding chains. Pa pa pa, a series of crisp sounds rang out. Although the sound was not loud, it was very clear in the sky. A few rays of golden light flew out from the black sword light. The golden light flickered slightly and gradually disappeared. Looking at Lu Xinwu again, his face showed a trace of redness. His eyes were filled with regret as he looked at the spirit binding chains that had been cut into several pieces. Haha, the Tao sect's methods are only SOSO. LV Jinyu, you're overthinking. The pitch-black swordsman raised his head and laughed. If it were up to me, why would we need to set up a formation in this sword catacomb? We could just directly kill our way into the 3 kingdoms of cultivation. Second brother. At this moment, a voice rang out not far from the dark-skinned man. Then a green sword light flashed and an extremely thin swordsman who was like a bamboo pole appeared. He was dressed in a green sword robe. LV Jinyo's great wisdom is not something you can measure. You've only defeated a mid-golden core cultivator. How can you be so arrogant? Don't embarrass the 3-sword sect. Yes, I know my mistake. Although the pitch-black man lowered his head in fear, it was obvious that he did not care. He even arrogantly winked at the group of golden core cultivators. Heng Zhao and the rest were frightened by the green and red sword light. When they saw the swordsman's green sword robe, they could not help but gasp. I am Qing Jian of the Three-Sword Sect. The tall and thin swordsman lowered his head slightly and looked at Heng Zhao and the rest. His face was expressionless like a block of wood. I am Bai Tianming of the Three-Sword Sect. The pitch-black man shouted loudly. His voice was much louder than Qing Jian's. I am Bai Shun of the Three-Sword Sect. Another voice rang out. It sounded soft like a female swordsman. But when everyone looked to the left of Qing Jian, where the yellow and red sword light flashed, what appeared was a white and fat male swordsman with a bulging belly. However, this white fatty had a bulging forehead, thin eyebrows, small eyes and white skin. He really did look like a female cultivator. Congratulations to my fellow Taoists of the Tao sect for breaking out of the yin-yang sword formation. Welcome to the 5 elemental swords formation. Qing Jian said calmly. His tone was filled with mockery. I have been waiting for you all for a long time, but I did not expect you to only break the yin-yang sword formation now. The yin-yang sword formation was set up by the Kuan sword sect and the Taihe sword sect together. You all actually spent so much time. Yes, you even lost so many disciples. This is really beyond my expectations. Chapter 2671. It's just a bullshit yin-yang sword formation. It's as easy as blowing off dust for us. Hearing Qing Jian's ridicule, Heng Teng couldn't help but get angry. Your 5-element sword formation is just a copy of my Tao sect's 5-element sword formation. What's there to be proud of? Is that so? Bai Tianming laughed and waved his hand. A pitch-black sword light flew out as he shouted, Come, come, come. I'll fight you one-on-one. Second brother. Without waiting for Heng Teng to reply, Qing Jian berated, The Tao sect's brats don't know any better. Why are you following suit? The one who set up the formation, fellow Sword Xiao, hasn't even reported his name. How can you start fighting? Hearing this, Heng Teng's nose almost became crooked from anger. Ah, that's right. We haven't even met with the Tao sect's cultivators. How can this formation be activated? About 300 meters away from Qing Jian and the others, there was another flash of white sword light. A sword cultivator wearing a white sword robe appeared, and beside him was a female swordsman wearing an aqua blue sword robe. I'm Xiao Jinding of the Sword Cauldron Sword Sect. Greetings to everyone from the Tao sect. There were some flaws in the sword formation just now, so I went to check it out. Please forgive me for not welcoming you. As he spoke, the swordsman named Xiao Jinding actually cupped his hands and bowed politely. I'm Luo Shuelan of the Flowing Water Sword Manor. Although the female swordsman was smiling like a flower, with blue sword light flashing around her body, she didn't speak much. She only spoke one sentence before stopping. Cut the crap. Lu Xingwu said coldly, let me see what kind of trash your 5-element sword formation is. This is Lu Xingwu of the Splendid Flower Sect. Xiao Jinding's face revealed a trace of astonishment. Your Splendid Flower Sect is one of the top sects in the country of Xi. Why are you so lacking in etiquette? Who said that the 5-element sword formation was set up by only 5 sword sects? We waited patiently here and didn't try to kill you. You call yourself the Orthodox Taoist, but you don't have the patience to wait for the masters of the sword formation to appear? You. Lu Xingwu's nose was even more crooked than Heng Teng's. Fellow Taoist Lu. Don't be anxious, don't be confused, calm your heart. Yuan Zhongyu of the Kunlun sect hurriedly shouted, This is the swordsman's trick to confuse us. He wants us to fall into his trap. We'll just wait for them to put on a show. That's right. Lu Xingwu's heart skipped a beat. He nodded at Yuan Zhongyu and said, Thank you for your reminder. I am a little impatient. Tell the disciples. Heng Li sent a voice transmission in a low voice. Set up an attack formation and charge to the west at any time. This old man is Qishan Meng Fan. In mid-air, there was an inexplicable fluctuation. Suddenly, a short and fat old man appeared. This old man looked very old. His hair and beard were snow white, and the top of his head was shiny. There was only a circle of hair around his head, which looked similar to a circle of beard. Looking at the old man's face again, he was very plain, no different from an ordinary farmer in the secular world. However, it was very similar to his name, Ordinary. This old man is Liao Ke of the 7 Spiritual Mountains. A high-pitched chirp of a bird resounded in the sky. A 5-colored light flew over from afar and entered everyone's field of vision in the blink of an eye. However, the light stopped about 1,000 feet away from everyone. Each of them was tall and skinny. Their eyes were slender and long. Their eyebrows were slanted to their temples. Their thin lips were slightly trembling under their tall noses. Their voices shook the surroundings. This swordsman looks a little similar to Xiao Hua. Li Zongbao and the rest flew closer and could see clearly. Li Zongbao could not help but feel surprised. He could not help but look at Fairy Hongxia. Even Fairy Hongxia was slightly stunned. However, she immediately frowned. Although this person was not Xiao Hua, there were some similarities between his eyebrows, especially that pair of phoenix eyes. However, this Liao Kei's eyes were full of arrogance. They were far from Xiao Hua's calm and amiable eyes. It could only be said that they were similar and could not be said to be similar. Good heavens, seeing the appearance of the seven swordsmen, Heng Feng and the rest could not help but feel a chill in their hearts. The previous yin-yang sword formation only had 4 second-grade illusory swordsmen. Now, there were actually 7 of them in the 5-element sword formation. This meant that the 5-element sword formation was even more powerful than the yin-yang sword formation. The yin-yang sword formation had killed more than half of the Dao Sect's Foundation Establishment middle stage cultivators and more than half of the Qi refinement stage cultivators. What about the 5-element sword formation? Xiong Huasong, Liao Kei said coldly, I heard that you are an expert in Black Sky Sect's formations. The 10 Directions Annihilation formation that LV Genyu was trapped in was your work. To tell you the truth, this 5-element sword formation is really much more powerful than the yin-yang sword formation. The heavens are virtuous, and I do not wish for too many cultivators to be buried here. If you know what's good for you, all of you should surrender. When my sword domain's sword transformation senior and your Dao Sect's nascent soul masters arrive, all of you will be able to return safely to the 3 cultivation countries. Although your reputation will be damaged, it is still 100 times better than dying here, right? Liao Kei's words were even more powerful than the yin-yang sword formation. In an instant, he had broken the bottom line of many low-level foundation establishment and Qi refinement stage cultivators. That's right, we will fight to the end. Although we will die, but who will remember us? Rather than that, why not surrender and return to our homeland after the war? Although our reputation is a little bad, we can still look forward to the great Tao. It is still better than cutting off our cultivation path. Alright. Many cultivators were muttering like this. Ha! Heng Feng flew a few feet forward and laughed loudly. You sword cultivators do not cultivate and do not know the power of the heavenly Tao. You are just making a fool of yourselves here. Not to mention that Tao cultivators are natural enemies. Will the cultivators who surrender be able to wait until the end of the war? Even if the cultivators who surrender are able to return to their sects alive, their Tao heart will be damaged and they will have inner demons on their cultivation path. How can they improve when the Tao is 1 foot tall and the devil is 10 feet tall? How can they improve? Rather than having inner demons in their hearts and not being able to cultivate the great Tao, why not be magnanimous and walk the path of killing sword cultivators to the end? If they die and their names go down in history. If they live, they can wash away their worries and their cultivation will improve by leaps and bounds. Are there no records of this in the records of the various sects? After the war, who knows how many cultivators have their realms and cultivations improved greatly? How can we Tao sect cultivators be short-sighted people like you who do not wait for the heavenly Tao? When Heng Feng said this, many cultivators felt a chill in their hearts. It was as if they had been enlightened, and many cultivators' foreheads were even covered in sweat. Liao Kei's words were not wrong, but he was a sword cultivator after all. How would he know about the Tao sect's cultivation? Heng Feng's words were even more correct. Unless the cultivator did not want to cultivate anymore and only wanted to escape with his life, then he should surrender. Otherwise, the inner demons would exist in his cultivation for the rest of his life. If he did not have a great opportunity, it would be extremely difficult to get rid of them. And such a great opportunity would probably be even more difficult than surviving the war of Tao cultivators. However, those who were enlightened naturally had the ability to comprehend. Those who did not could only sneer in their hearts and take Heng Feng's words as a form of encouragement. Haha, what heavenly Tao! What great Tao! Bai Shun laughed loudly. He actually formed an orchid shape with his fingers and pointed at Heng Feng. Now that there is no life, there is only the Tao of life and death. There was actually a kind of charm in the plump, fair man's eyes. It was even more beautiful than Luo Shuilan's. Let's go. Heng Feng could not be bothered to say anything else. He waved his hand and secretly transmitted his voice. Instantly, the group of late Foundation Establishment stage disciples around Heng, as well as a dozen early Oris core stage cultivators, all moved and flew towards the west. Heng Feng and the rest had already broken through the boundary of the yin-yang sword formation. However, they did not see the disciples outside the formation. Naturally, they knew that they had already died at the hands of Tao cultivators. They had long been anxious to leave this place. Now that they had received Hung Feng's orders, they all activated their dermic powers and wanted to rush out of the 5-element sword formation that had yet to be activated. Haha, I heard that Tao cultivators are all knowledgeable people. Previously, they did not wait for their masters to arrive before speaking. Now, they want to leave without even waiting for their masters to speak. Really? I don't know what to say. Xiao Jinding covered his mouth and laughed. He looked very refined and was not worried about the cultivators escaping far. They are in a hurry to die. Qing Jian said coldly. Big brother, we. Bai Tianming was about to say something when suddenly Heng Feng, Yuan Zhongyu, and the rest moved at the same time. They clapped their hands together and the talismans that they had flaunted earlier appeared once again. Several brilliant rays of light flashed and countless powerful hurricanes were born. Combine. Qing Jian shouted when he saw this. Green sword light flashed around his body and a sprout-like sprout was born from his sword light. As the sword light flashed, the sprout-like sprout grew rapidly. In the blink of an eye, it had turned into a towering tree. Moreover, the tree did not stop growing. It grew bigger and taller again. Wong. A sword hum could be heard coming from the tree. The entire tree had turned into an incomparably huge sword. When Qing Jian turned into a sword, the other 4 Tao cultivators did not stop. Bai Tianming let out a roar. A pitch-black sword light rushed out and surrounded his iron tower-like body. Gradually, his body transformed into an iron tower. Moreover, this iron tower was in a quadrangular shape. The scattered sword chi condensed into strands of dust that resembled smoke. Bai shunned softly and bashfully like a mortal girl undressing. She covered her face with her hands and the yellow-green sword light on her hands continued to shoot out, completely covering her. With a loud bang, the sword light turned into sparks. A pillar-like huge sword surrounded by flames appeared in the air. A look of disdain appeared in Xiao Jinding's eyes. It was as if he despised Heng Ming and the others for not declaring war. However, he did not hesitate. He crossed his hands and a silver-white brilliance appeared in his hands. As he rubbed it on his arm, the silver-white brilliance overflowed and enveloped his entire body. Chapter 2672. Bang, the sound of a golden drum rang out, and Xiao Jinding's body gradually disappeared. A long sword that resembled a spear appeared in the air. The only woman among the 7 swordsmen was Luo Shuilan. Her movements were the smallest. She waved her hand, and a blue sword light rose up like a ladle and sprinkled on top of her head. Hua! The sound of water gushing out was like a fountain. Countless sword lights rushed out from the source of the sound, and flew straight up to a height of several feet. Along with the flickering of these sword lights, Luo Shuilan's figure also disappeared. The sword lights were like sparkling water droplets, shining with an extremely beautiful blue light. It was several times more beautiful than Luo Shuilan's. The moment the 5 giant swords appeared, they also absorbed the 5 elements spiritual qi from 100 zhang radius like a whale swallowing water. The sharpness of the sword qi and the restrictive power of the sword lights were not much inferior to the Yuanying hands of Heng Heng and the rest. Kill Liao Ke in ordinary first. Xiong Huasong immediately reminded everyone when he saw that the 5 of them had all transformed into swords. Ha ha ha. Liao Ke sneered as a 5-colored brilliance flashed around his body. In an instant, Liao Ke's body slowly elongated amidst the brilliance and 5-colored feathers appeared on his head. Furthermore, a pair of wings that were several feet in size slowly extended from Liao Ke's ribs as the brilliance flashed. A multicolored peacock slowly revealed its figure. Wu, Liao Ke flapped his wings slightly. As the 5-colored light and the feathers on his wings trembled, the 5-element spiritual qi within 100 zhang radius became chaotic. The Yuanying hands that were absorbing the spiritual qi of heaven and earth stopped at the same time, and the light trembled. Not good. Heng Heng and the rest seemed to have a bad premonition. They seemed to know what this splitting-edge 5-element sword formation was. Attack. Yuan Zhongyu and the rest activated their spirit talismans, sending the power from their golden dawn into them. At the same time, they tried their best to take out their magical treasures, wanting to kill Liao Ke before the 5 giant swords could take action. They wanted to prevent the formation from activating. Everyone rushed towards Liao Ke, leaving Ordinary to the side. However, Ordinary was extremely ordinary. There was no light around him, nor was there any fluctuation. Not even a trace of sword light could be seen. Furthermore, the heaven and earth spiritual energy that was like a hurricane also disappeared when it hit Ordinary's body. All of a sudden, Ordinary disappeared. He had disappeared into the hurricane. His disappearance did not attract the attention of any cultivators. However, a few moments later, Ordinary reappeared 1,000 feet away from the group of cultivators. However, the current Ordinary was different from before. Ordinary's originally short stature became even shorter. His entire body slowly elongated. Under the rising sun, Ordinary actually transformed into a flat disc that was a few feet in size. This disc was a little strange. It looked like it was made of metal but not metal. It looked like wood but not wood. There was no light on it. It was early in the morning and there were some pitter-patter of raindrops. However, when these raindrops fell on the disc, they did not stop. Instead, they penetrated it as if there was nothing there. Only when the warm sunlight shone on it did it emit some light. This light was not sword light, but more like fluorescent light. This fluorescent light spots looked like starlight. These starlight spots rotated mysteriously, and their color gradually deepened. The 5 giant swords seemed to let out a sword hum at the same time. They flew into the air and flew towards Liao Ke. "Quick, stop them!" Xiang Ming shouted without hesitation. The 5 flying swords flew extremely fast. In the blink of an eye, they were in front of Liao Ke's 5-colored peacock. However, to Xiang Ming and Xiong Huasong's surprise, the 5 flying swords swept past Liao Ke's 5-colored peacock without stopping at all. We've been tricked. When Heng Zhao and the rest looked in the direction of the flying swords, they saw the disc that was a few feet in size in the air, slowly rotating under the sunlight. The 5 flying swords rushed to the bottom of the disc and 5 sword chi rushed out. The flying swords directly covered the disc. Wong! The disc let out a huge rumbling sound, and as if it had eaten a large amount of spirit grass, it rapidly expanded. Whoosh! When the disc became a few dozen feet in size, the 5 flying swords rushed up and pierced the 5 edges of the disc. Peng! Just as the 5 flying swords came into contact with the disc, countless tiny sword flashes shot out from the disc. It was as if countless meteors were flying in all directions, trapping all the cultivators within the meteors. 5 planets disc? Xiong Huasong was the first to realize that something was amiss. He shouted in shock, "This? How did it end up in Hung Country? 5 planets disc? Is it the core of the legendary 5 planets reversal star array?" When Heng Zhao and the rest heard this, they were also shocked. The so-called 5 planets reversal array was a legendary ancient killing array. It had long been lost on the Dawn Rain continent. The cultivators of the Dao sect had only grown up listening to stories of how this array had killed powerful cultivators. How could they not be shocked when they heard that the Dharma artifact that had fused with Ordinary's body was the core of this array? If I'm not wrong, it should be this. Xiong Huasong naturally knew more about array formations than Heng Zhao and the rest. He had some impression of something that had long been annihilated, but he didn't dare to be sure. This guy is the key to this 5-element splitting blade array. At this point, even if Xiang Ming didn't say it, who wouldn't know? The few golden core cultivators immediately abandoned Liao Ke and used their half-formed nascent soul hands to attack the 5 planets disc. Wung. The humming of the swords grew louder and louder. The entire 5 elements disc began to rotate violently, and the 5 huge flying swords also began to rotate. As the 5 elements planetary disc rotated, more and more meteors shot out from it, almost covering the entire 5 elements planetary disc. The meteor emitted an extremely dazzling sword light, and the whistling sword energy pierced through the air. It simply charged aimlessly towards the entire 5 elements sword formation. Heng Zhao and the rest's nascent soul hands approached Ordinary with great difficulty. The closer they got, the more sword light shot out. Furthermore, the astrolabe and the 5 flying swords had almost merged into one, forming a colorless ball of light. The powerful sealing force of the several nascent soul stage cultivators did not seem to have any effect on the ball of light. In fact, the omnipresent sword chi was constantly neutralizing the nascent soul stage cultivators' hands and preventing them from getting closer. Heng Zhao and the rest's expressions changed slightly. This was the hand of a nascent soul. The reason why they dared to face a 3rd-grade illusory swordsman was because they knew that the hand of a nascent soul could destroy an illusory sword and was their guarantee of survival. But now, there were only 6 2nd-grade illusory swordsmen, and they were actually able to resist the hands of several nascent soul cultivators. How were they going to fight back? At this moment, a shocking bird cry rang out. Liao Ke, who had been ignored by everyone, suddenly flapped his wings again, and the five-colored light shot into the sky. Woo! Below everyone, the ground that had suddenly stopped trembled again, and cracks appeared like when the yin-yang sword array was activated. Oh no! Hundreds of thousands of cultivators were lucky survivors of the yin-yang sword array. How could they not know how powerful it was? They hurriedly stabilized their bodies and activated the simple array, preparing to receive the attack of the sword array. Unexpectedly, from the cracks on the ground, the five-colored sword light shot out. These sword lights did not attack the cultivators, but instead they shot straight into the sky. Even the sword lights below the cultivators did not directly attack them. Before the crowd of cultivators could react, the tens of thousands of sword lights collided with the meteors shot out by the five-colored ball of light high up in the sky. Crackle, the sound of frying beans filled the entire sword array, and it did not stop. An unbelievable scene appeared in front of the hundreds of thousands of cultivators. All the sword lights exploded with the sound, turning into countless fragments of light. The fragments of light floated in the air, sparkling and translucent. Moreover, each of the light spots had a different color. There were red, silver, black, blue, and even green. They complemented each other beautifully, making for an incomparably dazzling sight. Seeing how beautiful the five-element sword array was, all the cultivators were puzzled. Oh no, it's the spiritual energy of heaven and earth. Just as everyone was stunned for a moment, someone immediately sensed that something was wrong. Although the scene was so beautiful, the sparkling fragments of light were absorbing different types of heaven and earth spirit chi. Wherever the fragments of light covered, the heaven and earth spirit chi would be completely absorbed by the fragments of light, leaving not even a trace behind. Even near the nascent soul's hand, the spiritual energy of heaven and earth was nowhere to be seen. Although the nascent soul's hand was powerful, it was few in number. How could it compare to the omnipresent fluorescent light? Not good. Xiong Huasong and the rest finally understood the power of the five-element sword array. The spiritual energy of heaven and earth within the array was absorbed by the sword lights. Even if there were hundreds of thousands of cultivators in the Tao sect, where could they absorb the spiritual energy of heaven and earth? How could they fight against sword cultivators? After understanding the mystery behind this, Hengju and the others' backs were drenched in sweat. They were all shocked by LV Ruochang's calculations. Of course, the yin-yang sword array could kill Qi refinement stage cultivators, and the five-element sword array could kill foundation establishment stage cultivators. Then, what would happen after the five-element sword array? It would probably be a sword array that could kill golden core cultivators? Quick, kill this bastard! Hung Feng and De Sun shouted. The golden cores in their dantians were surging, and they did not dare to hold back their true essence. They did not care whether or not they could absorb the spiritual energy of heaven and earth from the sword array. They poured their dermic powers into the nascent soul's hand. Whoa! The nascent soul's hand indeed let out a roar and flashed with brilliance. Several waves of restrictive power increased once again and enveloped the five-element sword array. How can it be so simple? Liao Ke's voice rang out. It was very arrogant. As Liao Ke flew, the five-element sword array flashed with brilliance. As it flapped with all its might, an extremely large amount of fluorescent light surged into the nascent soul's hand. Pa! The first sound came from somewhere, but it was no longer important. Following that, the sound of explosions rang out everywhere. Chapter 2673. Right in front of Li Zongbao, several fluorescent lights suddenly exploded. From one of the fluorescent lights, a small sword about 3 inches long suddenly flew out, stabbing towards Li Zongbao's face at an even faster speed than the lightless shadow. The most frightening thing was that from the other fluorescent lights, small swords of various colors also flew out, stabbing towards Li Zongbao without any sign or direction. Not good. Although Li Zongbao had been on guard for a long time, when he saw such a strange situation, he was still somewhat unprepared. The immortal piercing whip in his hand was swung out without hesitation. Fortunately, Li Zongbao's immortal piercing whip was usually in his hand and didn't need to be used. Unlike some of the nearby cultivators, who habitually took out their magic treasures and waited until the light of their magic treasures dimmed before suddenly realizing that the spiritual chi of heaven and earth inside the sword formation had long been absorbed by the fluorescent lights and was used to transform into flying swords. As the immortal piercing whip was swung, a string of whip shadows flew out, pa pa pa, protecting Li Zongbao's body and knocking away several flying swords. At this time, miserable screams were heard one after another from the nearby cultivators, all of whom were pitiful cultivators who couldn't defend themselves in time after taking out their magic treasures and being stabbed by the flying swords. These miserable screams were obviously more frequent than the yin-yang sword formation. The surviving chi refining cultivators were no longer lucky. Their flying yellow talismans, defensive yellow talismans, and magic treasures all relied on the spiritual chi of heaven and earth from the outside world. The true chi in their bodies was simply insufficient to support them. The sparkling sword lights had taken away all the spiritual chi of heaven and earth, cutting off their escape route. Moreover, although these flying swords looked very small, the sword chi inside them was extremely sharp. Even if the chi refining cultivators could block the first sword light, it would be difficult for them to dodge the second sword light. When the third and fourth sword light arrived without any warning, no ordinary chi refining cultivator could stand in mid-air. Since the aura refining cultivators were forced into such desperate straits, the early stage and mid-stage foundation establishment disciples weren't any better off either. Amidst this chaotic sword formation, they were only able to resist for a short moment. Once they let down their guard, a flying sword would appear out of nowhere and slash into their bodies. Li Zongbao was like this. He had just knocked away several flying swords and was about to raise his hand to block a flying sword that was slanting towards his neck. Suddenly, a sense of vigilance rose from under his feet. Almost without thinking, he quickly dodged. With a whoosh, a water blue sword light flew past his armpit. That powerful sword chi penetrated his body's defense, causing the brilliance around his body to flash continuously. Smack! Li Zongbao didn't even have time to take in a breath of cold air. He hastily swung his immortal piercing whip again, knocking away the flying sword that was still stabbing towards his back. However, right at this moment, another unexpected event occurred. The flying sword had just touched Li Zongbao's immortal piercing whip when it exploded once more with a cracking sound. Over a dozen even smaller flying swords shot towards Li Zongbao from all directions. Not good. Li Zongbao hastily activated his true core strength. While his right hand waved the immortal piercing whip to block the flying swords, his left hand released a defensive magic art. Crack! Li Zongbao's defense had just taken shape when the round shield was destroyed by two flying swords. Even the immortal piercing whip was only able to knock down several flying swords. There were still several flying swords of different colors that rushed towards Li Zongbao's body. Li Zongbao was greatly alarmed. He was now a cultivator in the late stage of foundation establishment. If even he couldn't dodge these flying swords, how could others dodge them? Li Zongbao hastily swung his sleeve. Similar to Xiaohua's Heaven and Earth sleeve, it was the Utmost Happiness faction's cuff restriction. In an instant, it covered the several flying swords. Naturally, Li Zongbao's cuff restriction was far inferior to Xiaohua's Heaven and Earth sleeve. However, the Utmost Happiness faction's magic art was also unique. Puff, puff. Li Zongbao's Taoist robe was pierced by several flying swords, but the flying swords had already dimmed a lot. Li Zongbao merely waved the immortal piercing whip and immediately knocked down the flying swords. Li Zongbao could clearly see that even though the sword light was shot down, the sword light had turned into even more sparks and scattered in the air like the starlight from before. It could turn back into a sword at any time to assassinate a cultivator. Splitting Edge 5 Elemental Sword Formation. It really lives up to its name. At this moment, Li Zongbao was really convinced. This sword formation was definitely not inferior to the Golden Destruction Formation. While Li Zongbao was struggling to deal with it high up in the sky, the nascent soul hands that Heng Zhao and the others had sent out were also in trouble. The nascent soul hands were extremely powerful, but they also required a lot of heaven and earth spiritual chi. The 5 elemental sword fragments absorbed all the heaven and earth spiritual chi nearby, making it difficult for the nascent soul hands to form. Furthermore, under Liao Kei's control, an extremely large number of sword light fragments exploded around the nascent soul's hands. The hundreds and thousands of flying swords stabbed towards them like maggots. Although the nascent soul's hands had the power to restrain, Under the impact of the flying swords, they gradually loosened. Even the talismans in the nascent soul's hands were attacked by the flying swords. Heng Zhao and the other golden core cultivators had a protective golden light around their bodies. When the flying swords hit them, they only flashed with golden light and could not really hurt their bodies. However, such an endless attack also consumed their dermic powers. Therefore, the golden core cultivators who were supporting the nascent soul hands could not free themselves to cast any spells to attack the 5 elements planetary disk. Of course, other than Heng Zhao and the other golden core cultivators who had spiritual talismans, there were many other golden core cultivators. These cultivators also took out their own dermic treasures and wanted to attack the 5 elements planetary disk. However, the flying swords were shooting out from the 5 elements planetary disk. The golden core cultivators could not get close to the 5 elements planetary disk and were immediately attacked by hundreds of flying swords. While the cultivators were protecting themselves, how could they really get close to the 5 elements planetary disk? What should we do now? Heng Zhao was a little anxious. He clearly knew that as long as they formed their nascent soul hands and restrained the 5 elements planetary disk, the 5 element swords that were everywhere in the sword formation would disappear. However, the nascent soul hands could not do anything. It was not just spiritual talismans. Without the 5 element spiritual qi, all the dermic spells and dermic treasures of the Dao sect were useless. It was not that Heng Zhao had not considered the possibility of the sword formation blocking the spiritual qi of heaven and earth. However, sword cultivators also needed spiritual qi of heaven and earth. If sword cultivators did not use spiritual qi of heaven and earth, their flying swords were just decorations. However, Heng Zhao had never imagined that sword cultivators would use such a method of encroachment, using countless tiny flying swords to snatch spiritual qi of heaven and earth from other cultivators. This method, even if Heng Zhao racked his brains, he would not be able to think of it. It's this thing. Just as Heng Zhao was at a loss of what to do, a ray of blue light in the distance attracted his attention. His eyes lit up and he had an idea. Heng Zhao was looking in the direction of Li Zongbao. Li Zongbao's cultivation was indeed impressive. Although he could not use the spiritual qi of heaven and earth outside his body, he could not completely defend against the flying swords with just the true essence in his body and the immortal piercing whip. Finally, he was hit by a few flying swords. Fortunately, Li Zongbao had a protective dermic treasure, so the flying swords were easily blocked. However, he knew that this protective dermic treasure was his last line of defense. Without true essence replenishment, his bottom line would be lowered every time the flying swords hit him. Therefore, he waved the immortal piercing whip with all his might to block the flying swords. And the flying swords were like locusts, inexhaustible. In fact, the flying swords that he shattered could still transform into flying swords. Such an endless cycle would cause even a nascent soul cultivator to eventually run out of true essence, right? Just as he was in a predicament, a ray of blue light flashed by. Just as he looked up, he immediately felt his heart tremble. Li Zongbao knew that this was Fairy Hong Xia's Khanate primordial water. When he retracted his gaze, the thin layer of primordial water wrapped around him. At this moment, other than Fairy Hong Xia, Mingyu, Ji Mingxiu, and the rest were all within the primordial water. Many thanks, Li Zongbao said calmly. He had wanted to protect Fairy Hong Xia on account of Xiao Hua and Kai Zhuoxia. Who would have thought that he would be protected by Fairy Hong Xia again and again? Khanate primordial water. Li Zongbao immediately thought of the method Xiao Hua used to kill Qin Jian. He thought to himself, this item must have been given to Fairy Hong Xia by Xiao Hua. Fairy Hong Xia's Xiantian primordial water was indeed effective. Although it was only a thin layer, all the tiny swords that dashed over could no longer maintain the shape of flying swords when they were not covered by the primordial water. Once again they turned into tiny specks of light and disappeared into the primordial water. Khanate item. Impressive indeed. Li Zongbao sighed. Suddenly his heart lit up. He hurriedly shouted, Junior Sister Hong Xia, open up a small gap in the primordial water. Although Fairy Hong Xia did not understand why, she still did it anyway. Master and disciple were truly of one heart. When Li Zongbao looked up at the invincible 5-colored ball of light in the sky, Heng Heng's gaze also fell on it. Although Heng Heng did not say anything, his gaze met with Li Zongbao's. Li Zongbao understood his master's thoughts. He turned around and said, Junior Sister Hong Xia, in this 5-element splitting-edge sword formation, everything will be attacked by the 5-element swords. Khanate items are an exception. Khanate primordial water, Khanate primordial fire, Khanate primordial wood, Khanate Primordial Gold and Khanate Primordial Earth can all counter this sword formation. Among the hundreds of thousands of cultivators, there are many who have such encounters. However, looking around us, we have yet to see such a person. Only Junior Sister has this Khanate Primordial Water. Therefore, to break this formation and save the hundreds of thousands of Dao sect disciples, it all depends on Junior Sister. This. Fairy Hong Xia was slightly taken aback. She did not expect that the heavy responsibility of saving hundreds of thousands of Dao sect disciples would fall on her shoulders. Of course, Fairy Hong Xia was also an outstanding person. She knew that this was a great opportunity. After thinking for a while, she nodded and said, "I will follow Senior Brother Li's instructions." "Good. Follow me." Li Zongbao was overjoyed. Chapter 2674. Senior Brother Li. Ji Mingxiu said anxiously, "The swordsmen who set up the array are all grade 2 illusory swords. Now that they have transformed into flying swords, how can Foundation establishment disciples like us withstand their attacks? Why don't Senior Sister Hong Xia hand over the Khanate Primordial Water to the Golden Core Masters?" Li Zongbao nodded and looked at Fairy Hong Xia. "That works too, as long as Junior Sister Hong Xia is willing to part with it for the time being." Fairy Hong Xia smiled bitterly. If the Khanate Primordial Water was in the Mist-Tide Pearl, it would be fine no matter what. However, she had already sent the Mist-Tide Pearl into her Ice Phoenix body. Even if she wanted to take it out, she could not. It's not that I'm unwilling. It's just that I can't take it out. I can only control it myself. Fairy Hong Xia shook her head. "Alright Hong Xia, you can go now. I'll be responsible for the safety of Mingxiu and the rest for now." Mingyu took out her magic treasure Mingyu and said softly, "Thank you, Martial Ant Mingyu." Fairy Hong Xia looked into the distance and said, "There's a crimson-red glow over there and an azure-blue glow over there. It must be the Xiantian Primordial Fire and Primordial Water. If Martial Uncle has the time, you can head over and search for it." "Thank you, Martial Ant Mingyu. I'll immediately report to Master and send more Golden Core Masters to look for disciples who have Khanate Primordial Water to refine magic treasures." Li Zongbao said hurriedly. "Let's go." Seeing Fairy Hong Xia release a corner of the Khanate Primordial Water, Mingyu waved her hand and led the group away. After Mingyu and the rest flew away, Fairy Hong Xia activated the Khanate Primordial Water to protect herself and Li Zongbao as she flew into the sky. How could the Golden Core Masters not know what Fairy Hong Xia's Khanate Primordial Water meant? They were all overjoyed. Xiang Ming even shouted, "Martial Niece Hong Xia, you are the main contributor to breaking this array. Not only will my Rinsing Flower sect record your merit, even the dozens of sects in the Three Kingdoms will have to be grateful to you." Only Xiong Huasong frowned and shouted, "Fellow Taoists, please hold off these annoying flying swords. I'll discuss this with my martial niece." "Thank you for your trouble, fellow Taoist Xiong." Heng Zhao knew that he and the others were inferior to Xiong Huasong in terms of array formations, so he naturally activated his golden core again. His dermic powers surged out and supported the nascent soul hand once again. Even Liao Ke, who was flapping his wings to activate the 5-elemental firefly fragment, had a slight change in expression. Although the splitting-edge 5-elemental sword array had ordinary as the array core, with the azure sword and the other 5-elemental flying swords as support to activate the array, Liao Ke was also an extremely important figure. He was a mutated peacock bird cultivator and was adept at conjuring the 5-elemental spirit chi. Ordinary and company were the array core and had no time to fend for themselves, so Liao Ke was responsible for defending and protecting the array core. Although there were dozens of Golden Core cultivators among the Dao sect cultivators earlier, these Golden Core cultivators had been caught off guard and were unable to mobilize the spiritual energy of heaven and earth. Hence, they had been suppressed and attacked by the 5-element broken fireflies. On the other hand, Liao Ke had relied on his unique peacock talent to control a large number of broken fireflies and was not at a disadvantage against dozens of Golden Core cultivators. This had caused his originally arrogant heart to become even more arrogant. At this moment, when Liao Ke saw Fairy Hong Xia's Khanate Primordial Water approaching, his heart skipped a beat. With a flap of his wings, thousands of broken fireflies rushed towards Fairy Hong Xia. There were so many of these broken fireflies and they were so powerful that a beginner golden core cultivator who was standing between the two barely managed to hold on for a moment. Not daring to stay any longer, he hurriedly dodged and sent the wave-like broken fireflies towards the Khanate primordial water. Pa pa pa, continuous sounds of explosions could be heard near the Khanate primordial water. Thousands of small swords were formed and charged towards the Khanate primordial water. I'd like to see. How many drops of your Khanate primordial water can you possibly have? Liao Ke saw the thousands of small swords falling into the Khanate primordial water and turning back into the 5 elemental spirit chi. He could sense that Fairy Hong Xia's Khanate primordial water was not completely suppressing the 5 element swords. The 5 elemental spirit chi that had turned back into Khanate primordial water was also disrupting it. In fact, it even clashed with the Khanate primordial water and turned it into nothingness. Liao Ke understood that as long as his 5-element broken fireflies were sufficient, Fairy Hong Xia's Khanate primordial water would be depleted sooner or later. Therefore, Liao Ke flapped his wings and diverted most of his energy to Fairy Hong Xia's side. Rinsing Flower Sex Kai Hong Xia greets Martial Uncle Xiong. Fairy Hong Xia controlled the Khanate primordial water to block Liao Ke's attack while looking at Xiong Huasong who had flown below the Khanate primordial water. Xiong Huasong did not stand on ceremony and asked directly, "How many drops of Khanate primordial water do you have? Your cultivation is still weak, you can lend me some of your Khanate primordial water." "I'll let Martial Uncle Xiong know." Fairy Hong Xia said anxiously, "I have a lot of Khanate primordial water, but as for how many drops, I'm not sure." "Great." Xiong Huasong was worried that Fairy Hong Xia did not have much Khanate primordial water, which was why he was so worried. When he heard that Fairy Hong Xia did not know how many drops she had, he was overjoyed. "Quick, give it to me. I've refined the Misty Tide Pearl that contains the Khanate primordial water together with the Khanate primordial blood Dharma body. I'm unable to give it to Martial Uncle." Fairy Hong Xia did not dare to hide anything and replied hurriedly. "Huh? Refining a magic treasure together with the Dharma body? How did you come up with such an unimaginable method?" Xiong Huasong was in disbelief. This is the first time I've heard of this." Li Zongbao, who was at the side, was silent. Naturally he could not speak. "It was just a sudden idea," Fairy Hong Xia said softly. "Oh well," Xiong Huasong knew that this was not the time to ask too many questions. He said hurriedly, "When you release the Khanate primordial water, will it be able to completely block off the 5-colored light?" Fairy Hong Xia knew what Xiong Huasong was referring to. She raised her head and looked at it. Biting her lips, she thought for a while and said, "I'll try my best." "Great." Xiong Huasong clapped his hands again and said, "Release the Dharma body and control the Misty Tide Pearl to release the Khanate primordial water, blocking off the 5-colored light. You'll have done a great service." "Is that simple?" Fairy Hong Xia could not believe it. "Of course it's that simple." Xiong Huasong smiled and said, "Once you block off the eye of the splitting edge 5-elemental sword formation, those darn flying swords will not be able to be produced. Then our talismans will be able to be used. With the talismans, their 5-elemental swords will be nothing." "Do you understand?" "I understand." Fairy Hong Xia nodded hurriedly. Martial Uncle Xiong. Li Zongbao, who was at the side, narrowed his eyes and reminded, "Junior Sister Hong Xia is only a Foundation Establishment middle stage disciple. Even if she can control the Khanate primordial water, she can't possibly block off the 5-elemental sword's disc all by herself, right? Why don't we find a few more disciples who have Khanate items to refine magic treasures? It won't be too late to do that." "How can a magic treasure refined by a Khanate item compare to a Khanate item?" Xiong Huasong waved his hand and said, "Besides, a Khanate item won't be of much use. If Martial Niece Hong Xia has a few drops of Khanate primordial water, we won't have to place our hopes on her." "But," Li Zongbao still shook his head, "Junior Sister Hong Xia released the Dharma body, she will definitely be attacked by the 5-elemental swords. With us guarding by her side, what else can she do?" Xiong Huasong replied without hesitation. Li Zongbao originally wanted to say, "You guys are already in a sorry state, how can you care about others?" However, Xiong Huasong was after all a golden core master, and Li Zongbao did not dare to offend him. Then, Li Zongbao said again, "If Junior Sister Hong Xia covers up the eye of the formation, there are 6 grade 2 illusory swordsmen at the eye of the formation. Senior Sister Hong Xia, Martial Niece Zongbao, Xiong Huasong said coldly, "This is an urgent matter. In the time that you have asked these few questions, thousands of disciples have already fallen in my sect. Even if Marshal niece Hong Xia is in danger of dying, which one do you think is more suitable to exchange her death for the lives of hundreds of thousands of disciples?" Li Zongbao was silent, and his eyebrows twitched slightly. "Junior will go." Fairy Hong Xia knew that Xiong Huasong's words were cruel and heartless. If she wanted to protect herself, she would definitely not risk her life. However, since she was already trapped in the sword formation, and since she had already joined the battle, she would encounter many things that were beyond her control. Hence, she would not be able to make a choice. "I will accompany you," Li Zongbao said helplessly. He also knew that this was probably the best choice. "Senior brother Li, you don't have to come over." Since Fairy Hong Xia had already made her decision, she said indifferently, "Junior sister is going to release the Dharma body. Under the primordial water, I cannot take care of others. Senior brother, it is better for you to leave this place." Li Zongbao nodded and reminded, "Be careful. Junior sister knows." Fairy Hong Xia nodded. After hesitating for a moment, she said, "If anything happens to junior sister, you must inform him. Let him take revenge for me." "Don't worry. Definitely." Li Zongbao's words were concise, and he immediately escaped from the Xiantian primordial water. Xiong Huasong, who was standing by the side, was stunned. He saw Li Zongbao defending Fairy Hong Xia, and thought that Li Zongbao had feelings for her. Who knew that Fairy Hong Xia had left her last words for someone who was not Li Zongbao, and even wanted that person to take revenge for her? What was even stranger was that Li Zongbao actually agreed to it, as though he would definitely take revenge for Fairy Hong Xia. At that moment, Xiong Huasong's heart skipped a beat. That he couldn't be some nascent soul stage master? Even if it is a nascent soul stage master, so what? Xiong Huasong steeled his heart. Since things have come to this, even if a nascent soul stage master blames me, he can't do anything to me. Let's go. Xiong Huasong also flew out of the Xiantian primordial water. That half-nascent soul stage hand that was swaying in midair was still being attacked by many flying swords, and it was barely holding on. A phoenix cry resounded through the 9 heavens, and an ice phoenix celestial body flew out from Fairy Hong Xia's body. Above that misty green ice phoenix celestial body, strands of water-type heaven and earth spiritual chi condensed. Those slanted eyes of the ice phoenix celestial body flashed with a cold brilliance, and a domineering aura surged out from the ice phoenix celestial body. Seeing that the ice phoenix celestial body was released, the mutated peacock that Liao Ke had transformed into also raised its neck and cried out. The same cry shook the surroundings as though it wanted to compete with the ice phoenix. Not only that, as Liao Ke's wings flapped, an endless hurricane was created, and waves after waves of 5 elemental swords flew towards the ice phoenix celestial body. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.